I was just a kid back in '64, but I'll never forget that summer in Sister Lakes. It was supposed to be a normal vacation at my grandparents' cabin by the lake, but it turned into the most terrifying few days of my life. It all started on a muggy Tuesday afternoon. I was helping Grandpa clean out the shed when we heard Mrs. Atrop from next door screaming bloody murder. We rushed over to find her white as a sheet on her porch, babbling about some huge creature she'd seen in the woods behind her house. It was massive, at least 9 feet tall, she kept saying. All black and hairy, must have weighed 500 pounds. It looked right at me with these glowing eyes, then took off into the trees. Grandpa tried to calm her down, saying it was probably just a bear, but Mrs. Atrop wasn't having it. I know what I saw. It was walking on 2 legs like a man. But it wasn't a man. It was some kind of monster. I felt a chill go down my spine. Even as a 12-year-old kid, I could tell this wasn't just some wild animal sighting. There was real fear in Mrs. Atrop's eyes. Word spread fast in our little community. By that evening, it seemed like everyone was talking about the Sister Lakes monster. A couple of the local men, including Gordon Brown from the bait shop, went to check out the woods where Mrs. Atrop had her encounter. They came back looking spooked. Found some weird tracks back there, Gordon told us at the general store. Big as dinner plates, but not like any animal prints I've ever seen. And there was this awful smell, like something rotting. I begged Grandpa to take me to see, but he refused. No way we're going traipsing through those woods with some unknown creature on the loose, he said firmly. The next morning, things really started to get crazy. A group of farm workers reported seeing the monster near one of the orchards. They said it was chasing after some deer, moving incredibly fast for something so big. One of the men swore he saw it catch a full-grown buck and snap its neck like a twig. By noon, the sheriff's department was involved. They tried to keep things calm, but it was too late. News had gotten out to the surrounding towns, and people started pouring in, hoping to catch a glimpse of the monster. Cars lined the rural roads for miles. It was like the whole area had turned into some kind of twisted, monster-hunting amusement park. I'd never seen anything like it. Locals were setting up stands, selling monster bait and T-shirts. Someone even brought in one of those searchlights they use for grand openings, sweeping it across the woods at night. The air was thick with excitement and fear, but for those of us who lived there, it wasn't a game. That night I lay awake in my bed at the cabin, every little sound making me jump. The woods that had always felt so familiar now seemed alien and threatening. I kept imagining that creature, massive and dark, lurking just beyond the trees. Things came to a head on Thursday. A bunch of out-of-towners decided to organize a big monster hunt. They got all liquored up and headed into the woods with guns and whatever makeshift weapons they could find. The sheriff tried to stop them, but there were just too many. I'll never forget the sounds that came out of those woods that night. Gunshots, shouting, and then something else. A roar that didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. It was deep and guttural, almost human, but not quite. It echoed across the lake, setting off car alarms and making dogs for miles around start howling. There was chaos after that. People came running out of the woods, pale and wide-eyed. Some were crying, others looked like they were in shock. I overheard one man telling the sheriff, "It's real. I swear to God it's real." We cornered it and, Jesus, the strength of that thing. It threw a guy 20 feet like he was nothing. The police set up roadblocks and started clearing people out of the area. They were talking about bringing in the National Guard. But by morning, it was like the whole thing had never happened. No more sightings, no more roars in the night. The monster, if it had ever really been there, was gone. The tourists packed up and left. The locals tried to go back to normal, but things were never quite the same after that. There was always this tension, this feeling that something was watching us from the shadows. I've gone back to Sister Lakes many times over the years. It's a beautiful place, and most of the time I can almost convince myself that what happened that summer was just some kind of mass hysteria. But sometimes, when I'm there alone and the sun is setting over the lake, I swear I can feel eyes on me. And I remember that roar, that impossible, terrifying sound that still haunts my dreams. I don't know what was in those woods in the summer of '64. Maybe it was a bear or some other animal that got blown out of proportion. Maybe it was all just a hoax that got out of hand. But deep down, I can't shake the feeling that there was something out there. Something that didn't belong in our world. And sometimes I wonder, is it still out there somewhere, waiting? Story 2. I was just a teenager back in '65, living with my mom in Monroe County. It was a quiet little place. Nothing much ever happened there. But that August, everything changed. I still get chills thinking about it. It was a warm summer evening, and I was driving my mom home from her shift at the diner. We were chatting and laughing, just enjoying the night air coming through the open windows of my beat-up Chevy. The radio was playing some catchy tune. I think it was one of those new Beatles songs everyone was crazy about. As we turned onto the lonely stretch of road leading to our house, I noticed something odd in my peripheral vision. There was movement in the trees lining the road, like something big was crashing through the underbrush. I didn't think much of it at first, probably just a deer or something, but then I saw it step out onto the road ahead of us. My blood ran cold. This was no deer. In the glow of my headlights, I could see a massive, hairy figure. It had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe more. The body was covered in dark, matted fur. But the face, God, that face, it was almost human-like, but distorted. The eyes glowed an eerie yellowish color in the light. I slammed on the brakes instinctively. The tires squealed as we skidded to a stop about 20 feet from the creature. For a moment, we all just stared at each other. Me and my mom frozen in terror, this monster regarding us with an unnerving intelligence in its eyes. Then it moved towards us with shocking speed. Before I could react, it was at my window. I'll never forget the overwhelming stench of wet animal fur mixed with something rotten. Its massive hand, if you could call it that, smashed through my window. Glass shattered everywhere. I screamed as it grabbed a fistful of my hair, yanking my head towards the broken window. The pain was excruciating. I could feel my scalp tearing. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my mom desperately hitting at the thing's arm, trying to make it let go of me. But it was like she wasn't even there. The creature's face was inches from mine now. I could see its teeth, yellowed fangs that looked sharp enough to tear through flesh with ease. Its breath was hot and putrid against my skin. I thought for sure I was about to die. Suddenly, headlights appeared around the bend. Another car was coming. The monster's head snapped up, distracted by the approaching vehicle. In that moment of distraction, it released its grip on my hair. I didn't hesitate. I stomped on the gas pedal as hard as I could. The car lurched forward, tires spinning. I heard a thud and felt the impact as we hit the creature, but I didn't stop. I kept that pedal to the floor, my hands shaking so bad I could barely keep the wheel straight. My mum was sobbing next to me, but all I could focus on was getting us the hell out of there. I don't know how long we drove like that. It felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes before we reached the main road. As soon as I saw other cars and lights, I pulled over. My whole body was trembling uncontrollably. We sat there for a while, just trying to process what had happened. My mom kept touching my head gently, checking for injuries. There was some blood where that thing had grabbed me, but nothing too serious. We were alive. That was the important thing. Eventually, we gathered ourselves enough to drive to the police station. The officers there clearly thought we were crazy or drunk or both. They took our statements, but I could tell they didn't believe a word of it. One of them even had the nerve to ask if we'd been drinking or taking any funny pills. But we knew what we saw. That thing was real as you and me. And it was out there somewhere in the woods of Monroe County. Word spread fast in our small community. At first, most people treated it as a joke. But then others started coming forward with their own stories. Hunters who'd seen strange tracks in the woods. Campers who heard terrifying howls in the night. A farmer whose livestock had been brutally killed and partially eaten. Before long, it seemed like the whole county was gripped by monster fever. Every weekend, groups would form to go searching the woods. Some folks treated it like a fun adventure, packing picnic lunches and bringing the kids along. Others took it deadly serious, arming themselves to the teeth. I refused to join any of those expeditions. The memory of that night was still too fresh, too terrifying. I had nightmares for months afterward. Even now, decades later, I sometimes wake up in a cold sweat, feeling those claws in my hair again. The official search lasted for weeks. The local police, game wardens, even some state troopers got involved. They combed every inch of those woods but never found anything conclusive. No tracks, no hair samples, nothing. Some people started to doubt our story. There were whispers that we'd made it all up for attention. The police even made us take lie detector tests. The results were inconclusive, which only added fuel to the fire of speculation. But my mom and I knew the truth. We lived it. That creature was real, and it was still out there somewhere. As time passed, the excitement died down. People moved on to other things. But Monroe County was never quite the same. There was always that undercurrent of fear, especially on dark nights when the wind rustled through the trees. I left as soon as I could, moved to the city where I felt safer, surrounded by concrete and streetlights. But even now, all these years later, I can't shake the memory of that night. Sometimes when I'm driving on a lonely road at night, I find myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see that monstrous figure step out in front of me again. I don't know what that thing was. Bigfoot, some undiscovered species, or something else entirely. But I know it was real, and I know it's still out there, waiting in the shadows of Monroe County. So if you're ever driving through those parts, especially at night, keep your eyes on the road. But maybe roll up your windows just in case. You never know what might be lurking in the darkness, watching and waiting for its next victim. Story 3. That fateful night, a group of us decided to do a night hike through Miller's Woods on the outskirts of town. There were 5 of us total, me, Jessica, Mike, Tyler, and Chris. We'd done these night hikes dozens of times before, armed with our flashlights and snacks, giggling and telling scary stories as we tramped through the familiar trails. But this time was different. This time, something was waiting for us in those woods. It started off like any other hike. We met up at the trailhead around 9 p.m., the summer air still warm and heavy around us. Fireflies blinked lazily in the tall grass as we switched on our flashlights and headed into the tree line. For the first hour or so, everything seemed normal. We chatted and joked around, our beams of light sweeping across the forest floor as we walked. But then, about a mile in, we started hearing strange noises echoing through the trees. At first, it was just faint rustling sounds, like something large moving through the underbrush. We paused and listened, but when the noises stopped, we shrugged it off and kept going. A few minutes later, though, we heard what sounded like a low, guttural growl coming from somewhere off to our right. "Did you guys hear that?" Jessica whispered, her eyes wide with fear. We all nodded, suddenly on high alert. The playful atmosphere from earlier had evaporated, replaced by a tense silence. That's when Mike spotted something that made my blood run cold, a pair of glowing red eyes staring at us from the darkness between the trees. "Oh my God," he gasped. "Look!" We all swung our flashlights in that direction, illuminating a nightmarish sight that I'll never forget as long as I live. There, standing maybe 30 feet away, was the most terrifying creature I've ever seen. It was massive, at least 10 feet tall, covered in shaggy white fur that seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight. But it was the face that truly haunts me. A twisted, almost human-like visage, with burning red eyes and a mouth full of sharp yellow teeth. For a moment, we all just stood there, frozen in shock and terror. Then the thing let out an ear-splitting roar that shook me to my very core. That's when panic set in, and we all started running. I don't think I've ever run so fast in my life, branches whipping at my face as I sprinted blindly through the dark forest. I could hear the thundering footsteps of the creature behind us, getting closer and closer. Suddenly, there was a loud crashing sound, and I risked a glance over my shoulder. To my horror, I saw the white beast scaling a massive oak tree with impossible speed and agility, its claws gouging deep furrows in the bark. In my panic, I tripped over an exposed root and went sprawling to the ground, the wind knocked out of me. By the time I scrambled to my feet, I realized with growing dread that I was alone. My friends had kept running, leaving me behind. Gasping for breath, I spun in a circle, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness as I tried to get my bearings. That's when I heard a heavy thud behind me, and I slowly turned to see the white Bigfoot towering over me, having jumped down from the treetops. It was so close I could smell its musty animal odor and see the saliva glistening on its yellowed fangs. I wanted to run, to scream, to do something, but I was paralyzed with fear. All I could do was stare up at this impossible creature looming over me, certain that I was about to die. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the beast let out another bone-chilling roar and bounded off into the trees with supernatural speed and grace. I don't know how long I stood there shaking before I finally snapped out of it and started running again. I didn't stop until I burst out of the woods and onto the main road, where I found my friends waiting anxiously. They were all visibly shaken and full of apologies for leaving me behind, but I barely heard them. I was too preoccupied with trying to process what I'd just experienced. In the days and weeks that followed, we tried to make sense of what had happened that night. We scoured the internet for information on albino Bigfoot sightings, and even went back to the woods in the daytime to look for tracks or other evidence. But we never found anything conclusive. The experience changed me profoundly. I went from being an enthusiastic cryptid hunter to someone who actively warns others about the dangers lurking in those woods. I know now that not all Bigfoot are the gentle forest guardians that some believe them to be. Some of them harbor a dark, menacing energy that defies explanation. To this day, I can't shake the memory of those glowing red eyes and yellowed fangs. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear that unearthly roar echoing in the distance. I don't go into the woods at night anymore, and I've tried my best to put that summer behind me. But deep down, I know the truth. There are things out there in the darkness that defy our understanding of the natural world. And sometimes, if we're not careful, we might just come face to face with them. Story 4. That night started out normal enough. We'd finished dinner and were sitting around the campfire, chatting and enjoying the stillness of the forest. It must have been close to midnight when we first heard the noises. At first, it was just faint rustling in the underbrush, nothing too unusual for being out in nature. But then the sounds got louder, more deliberate. Heavy footsteps and branches snapping, circling our campsite. We all fell silent, straining to listen. The footsteps seemed to be moving in a wide circle around us, never getting too close, but never fading away either. It went on for what felt like hours. None of us wanted to admit how freaked out we were getting. Finally, my friend Jake whispered, "We should check it out." 3 others nodded in agreement: Chris, Megan, and Tyler. I hesitated, but in the end, my curiosity won out over my fear. Our professor was dozing in his tent, so we grabbed our flashlights and quietly headed into the darkness. The sounds led us deeper into the forest. We moved slowly, jumping at every snapped twig. About 10 minutes in, Jake suddenly froze and pointed his flashlight beam ahead. There, standing motionless between two massive pine trees, was the creature. I'll never forget that first glimpse. It was enormous, at least 8 feet tall, maybe more, covered in shaggy fur that looked almost marbled, lighter in some spots. But it was the face that struck me most, so eerily human-like, yet not. Deep-set eyes that reflected our flashlight beams, a heavy brow, a wide, flat nose. For a few seconds, we all just stood there in shock, staring at each other. Then Chris let out a strangled gasp, and the spell was broken. The creature's head snapped towards us, and in one fluid motion, it turned and bounded away with incredible speed. We chased after it, stumbling through the undergrowth. Suddenly we came to the edge of a wide ditch, easily 20 feet across. Without breaking stride, the creature leaped over it in a single bound. We skidded to a halt, jaws dropped in disbelief. No animal that size should be able to move like that. Heart pounding, I turned to the others. Their faces mirrored the mix of terror and awe I was feeling. "Holy shit," Tyler whispered. That was Bigfoot. It had to be. We sprinted back to camp, shouting for our professor. He emerged bleary-eyed from his tent as we babbled out our story. To his credit, he took us seriously. He radioed the forest rangers right away. The rangers arrived about an hour later. They questioned us extensively and searched the area we described. They even found tracks, massive 3-toed footprints that made their jaws drop. I watched as they carefully made a plaster cast of the clearest print. That night changed everything for me. I've always been interested in wildlife, but I never imagined I'd encounter something like this. It challenged everything I thought I knew about the creatures inhabiting our forests. In the days and weeks that followed, I obsessively researched Bigfoot sightings and theories. The more I learned, the more questions I had. How could a creature that size remain largely undetected? What else might be out there that we don't know about? I know a lot of people are skeptical about Bigfoot. Before that night, I probably would have been too. But I know what I saw. That creature was real, and it was like nothing I've ever encountered before or since. Sometimes I still have nightmares about those eyes reflecting in the darkness. Other times I dream about chasing the creature, always just out of reach. I find myself scanning the tree line whenever I'm in the woods now, wondering if it's out there watching. The experience has given me a profound respect for the mysteries of nature. There's so much we don't understand about the world around us. I used to think we had most of it figured out, but now I realize how much we still have to learn. I've gone back to Sabine National Forest a few times since then, hoping for another glimpse. No luck so far, but I haven't given up. I know it's out there somewhere, and who knows? Maybe someday I'll have the chance to see it again and unravel more of the mystery. For now, I'm left with the memory of that incredible night, the fear, the wonder, and the knowledge that the world is a far stranger and more magnificent place than I ever imagined. It's a night I'll never forget, no matter how much time passes. I often find myself replaying every detail in my mind, searching for some explanation I might have missed. The way it moved with such grace despite its massive size, the intelligence in its eyes, the sheer impossibility of its existence. Sometimes I wonder if it was watching us long before we spotted it. Was it curious about us the way we were about it? Or was it trying to warn us away from its territory? I'll probably never know for sure. One thing I do know is that the experience has changed the way I approach my forestry studies. I'm more observant now, always on the lookout for signs that might have seemed insignificant before. Every unusual track or unexplained sound takes on new meaning. I've tried talking to my classmates about it a few times since that night. Some of them seem eager to forget the whole thing ever happened. Others have become as obsessed as I am, spending their free time researching cryptozoology and planning return trips to the forest. Our professor has been supportive, but I can tell he's conflicted. On one hand, he's a scientist committed to empirical evidence. On the other, he saw the footprint cast and heard our eyewitness accounts. I think it's challenged his worldview as much as it has ours. The forest rangers have been frustratingly tight-lipped about the whole thing. They took our statements and the footprint cast, but we haven't heard anything since. I can't help but wonder if they know more than they're letting on. Are there other reports they're not sharing? Other evidence? I've thought about going public with our story, but I'm worried about the attention it might bring. I don't want hordes of Bigfoot hunters descending on the forest, potentially disturbing the creature or its habitat. And selfishly, I guess I want to keep the experience sacred in a way. It feels like it belongs to us, those of us who were there that night. Still, I feel a responsibility to share what we saw. If these creatures really are out there, shouldn't the scientific community be studying them? Shouldn't we be protecting their habitats? But then I think about how humans tend to treat the unknown, and I wonder if secrecy might be the best protection. It's a lot to grapple with. Some days I wish I could go back to my old worldview, when the forests held beauty but no real mystery. But then I remember the awe I felt in that moment, staring into the eyes of something that shouldn't exist, and I wouldn't trade that for anything. So here I am, sharing my story anonymously online. Maybe you'll believe me, maybe you won't. But I hope it makes you look at the world a little differently. I hope it reminds you that there's still so much we don't know, so much left to discover. And if you ever find yourself in Sabine National Forest, keep your eyes open and your mind ready for wonder. You never know what you might see in the shadows between the trees. Story 5. I never thought I'd witness something so horrifying and unexplainable, let alone in my own backyard. My wife Gina and I had just moved to a beautiful 5-acre property in Haley, Idaho about a month ago. We were excited for a quieter life, surrounded by nature after years of living in the city. Little did we know the terror that awaited us in these peaceful-looking woods. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, and Gina and I were enjoying our coffee on the back porch, taking in the view of the surrounding forest and hills. We often saw deer grazing on the slopes behind our house, so it wasn't unusual to spot a small herd in the distance. I pointed them out to Gina, and we watched contentedly for a few minutes. Suddenly, without warning, 2 large, hairy creatures burst out of the tree line and charged towards the deer at an unbelievable speed. At first, I thought they might be bears, but as they got closer, I realized with growing horror that they were running on 2 legs. They were massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, and covered in dark, matted fur. Their movements were unnaturally fluid and powerful as they bounded up the hillside. I froze in shock, unable to process what I was seeing. Beside me, I heard Gina let out a strangled gasp. We watched in stunned silence as the creatures reached the panicked herd in seconds. Most of the deer managed to bolt away, but one wasn't fast enough. The 2 beings pounced on it simultaneously, bringing it down with terrifying efficiency. What happened next will haunt me for the rest of my life. Working together with an almost human-like coordination, the creatures literally tore the struggling deer in half. The sickening sound of ripping flesh and snapping bones carried clearly across the quiet afternoon air. Blood sprayed in an arc as the deer was ripped apart. I felt bile rise in my throat and heard Gina retch beside me. The creatures seemed oblivious to our presence as they crouched over their kill and began to feed, using hands that looked disturbingly human-like to shovel meat into their mouths. Despite the distance, I could make out details that chilled me to my core. the slope of their brows, the shape of their shoulders and hips that was far too human-like for comfort. These were no ordinary animals. I don't know how long we stood there frozen in horror. It felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Eventually, some primal instinct for self-preservation kicked in, and I grabbed Gina's arm, pulling her into the house. We slammed and locked the door behind us, hands shaking. "What the hell were those things?" Gina whispered, her face pale with shock. I shook my head wordlessly, my mind reeling, as it tried to make sense of what we'd just witnessed. Nothing in my life had prepared me for this. We spent the rest of the day huddled in the house, jumping at every little sound. I kept replaying the scene in my head, trying to convince myself there was some logical explanation. But I knew deep down that we had seen something that defied conventional understanding. The next morning, still shaken, we called the local wildlife services to report what we'd seen. I half expected them to dismiss us as crazies, but to my surprise they took our account very seriously. A team was dispatched to our property that same day to investigate. The wildlife experts combed the hillside where we'd seen the attack. They found clear evidence of the kill: blood, fur, and bone fragments scattered across a wide area. But there was something else that made my blood run cold. One of the agents pulled me aside and showed me a plaster cast they'd made of a massive footprint found nearby. It was unmistakably hominid in shape, but far larger than any human foot. "We've had reports of similar creatures in this region before," the agent told me in a low voice, "but this is some of the clearest evidence we've found yet. Whatever these things are, they're real." That night, as Gina and I lay sleepless in bed, every creaking floorboard and rustling leaf outside sent shivers down my spine. The realization that there were unknown, intelligent predators roaming these woods filled me with a deep, primal dread. In the days and weeks that followed, we struggled to come to terms with what we'd seen. We installed security cameras and floodlights around the property. I bought a high-powered rifle, something I never thought I'd need. But these precautions did little to ease the gnawing fear that had taken root in my gut. Sometimes at night, I swear I can hear strange vocalizations echoing from deep in the forest, not quite human, not quite animal. Gina says she's seen shadowy figures moving at the edge of the woods in the pre-dawn light. We've found strange scratches on trees at the edge of our property, far too high up to have been made by any normal wildlife. I find myself constantly questioning what I thought I knew about the natural world. If these creatures exist, what else might be out there that science hasn't discovered or acknowledged? How much do we really know about what lives in the vast wilderness areas of this country? The wildlife services have been back several times to investigate further, but they never find conclusive proof. It's clear they know more than they're letting on, but official statements always downplay the incidents. I get the sense that there's a concerted effort to keep knowledge of these beings under wraps. Gina and I have debated moving, but where would we go? How can we be sure we'd be safe anywhere else? And part of me feels a strange responsibility to stay, to bear witness to whatever is happening here. Someone needs to know the truth. So we remain, living on edge, never fully at ease in our own home. Every trip into the woods is fraught with tension. Every unusual sound in the night jolts us awake. We've become hyper-vigilant, always watching the tree line, always wondering when we might catch another glimpse of those terrifying creatures. I know how this story must sound to anyone who hasn't experienced it firsthand. Before that day, I would have dismissed such a tale as the ramblings of a madman or an attention seeker. But I know what I saw. Those creatures were real, and they're still out there. Sometimes I wish I could go back to my old life of blissful ignorance, but that's impossible now. Once you've seen behind the veil, there's no unseeing it. All I can do is stay alert, stay prepared, and hope that someday the truth about these beings will come to light. Until then, We live with the knowledge that there are monsters in these woods. Monsters that science says shouldn't exist, but undeniably do. If you're reading this and you've had similar experiences, know that you're not alone. And if you haven't, count yourself lucky. But remember, just because you haven't seen something doesn't mean it isn't real. There are things in this world beyond our understanding, and some of them are closer than we'd like to believe. Stay safe out there. Story 6. I was just 17 when it happened. Looking back now, I can't believe how stupid and reckless we were. But at that age, you think you're invincible. You don't realize the real dangers that are out there, lurking in the shadows. It was a typical boring Friday night in our small Idaho town. My best friend Jake and I were hanging out in his basement, playing video games and complaining about how there was never anything to do around here. That's when Jake got this brilliant idea. "Hey, you know that old abandoned cabin up in Miller's Woods?" he said with a mischievous grin. "I dare you to spend the night there." I scoffed. "Dude, that place is falling apart. It's probably full of rats and spiders." "Scared?" Jake taunted. "No way," I shot back. "It's just stupid. Come on, it'll be an adventure, way better than sitting here all night. Unless you're too chicken." I knew he was baiting me, but my teenage pride wouldn't let me back down from a challenge. "Fine, whatever. Let's do it." We packed some snacks, flashlights, and sleeping bags into Jake's beat-up Jeep. As we drove out of town, the houses and streetlights faded away, replaced by towering pines and inky darkness. I tried to play it cool, but a sick feeling was growing in my gut. There were rumors about Miller's Woods, stories of strange lights, unexplained sounds, people going missing. Most folks in town avoided the area. We bumped down an overgrown dirt road for what felt like forever before the headlights illuminated a dilapidated wooden structure. The cabin looked even worse than I remembered. Windows boarded up, roof sagging, porch steps rotted away. "Home sweet home," Jake said with forced cheerfulness as we got out of the Jeep. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of leaves under our feet. Inside wasn't much better. A thick layer of dust covered everything. Cobwebs clung to every corner. The floorboards creaked ominously with each step. "This is going to be awesome," Jake said, but I could hear the hint of doubt in his voice. We set up our sleeping bags in what used to be the living room and broke out some snacks. As we munched on chips, we swapped ghost stories and urban legends to pass the time. It was almost fun for a while, like any other sleepover. But as the night wore on, an uneasy feeling settled over me. The darkness outside the windows seemed to press in on us. Every little noise, a branch scraping against the roof, a floorboard settling, made me jump. Around midnight, we decided to try to get some sleep. I tossed and turned, unable to get comfortable on the hard floor. Just as I was finally drifting off, a sound jolted me fully awake. It was a low, guttural howl, unlike anything I'd ever heard before, not quite human, not quite animal. It echoed through the woods, raising goosebumps on my arms. "Jake," I whispered, "did you hear that?" "Yeah," he replied, voice tight with fear. "What the hell was it?" Before I could answer, another howl rang out, closer this time. Then another, from a different direction, and another. We scrambled out of our sleeping bags, hearts pounding. I fumbled for my flashlight with shaking hands. "We should get out of here," I said. Jake nodded, face pale in the dim light. But as we moved toward the door, a loud thump on the roof made us freeze. Something was up there, something big. Heavy footsteps creaked across the ceiling, dust and splinters rained down. Whatever it was far larger than any normal animal. Panic rising in my throat, I swung my flashlight toward the boarded-up windows. And that's when I saw them. A pair of glowing white eyes, peering in through a gap in the planks. They blinked once, then vanished. Jake saw them too. He let out a strangled yelp and stumbled backward. The howls started up again, a whole chorus of them now surrounding the cabin. They were getting closer. "We're trapped," Jake whimpered. My mind raced. We couldn't stay here, but going outside seemed like suicide. What the hell were those things out there? Suddenly, something slammed against the door. The whole cabin shook. Again and again it pounded, the old wood splintering. "The back door!" I shouted, grabbing Jake's arm. We sprinted through the kitchen, tripping over debris in our haste. Just as we reached the rear exit, the front door exploded inward with a deafening crash. Heavy footsteps thundered through the cabin. A stench like wet fur and rotting meat filled the air. With trembling fingers, I fumbled with the rusty lock on the back door. It finally gave way, and we burst out into the night. The woods were alive with movement. Dark shapes darted between the trees, far too big to be normal forest creatures. Those unearthly howls echoed all around us. We ran blindly, branches whipping our faces, roots threatening to trip us at every step. I could hear something crashing through the underbrush behind us, gaining ground rapidly. Ahead, I spotted Jake's jeep. We sprinted toward it, fueled by pure terror. "The keys!" Jake gasped. "Where are the keys?" With horror, I realized we'd left them inside the cabin. We were so panicked, we'd forgotten the most important thing. A massive shape burst from the tree line behind us. In the dim moonlight, I caught a glimpse of matted fur, impossibly long arms, a face that was almost human, but horribly wrong. "Run!" I screamed. We took off again, no destination in mind except away. Branches tore at our clothes, rocks and thorns shredded our feet, but we didn't dare slow down. I don't know how long we ran. It felt like hours. My lungs were on fire, legs trembling with exhaustion. But the sounds of pursuit never faded. Just when I thought we couldn't go on, lights appeared ahead. Jake's house. We'd somehow made it back to the edge of town. With a final burst of speed, we sprinted across the lawn and pounded on the door. "Let us in!" Jake yelled. "Please, let us in!" The porch light flicked on. Jake's dad opened the door, looking confused and alarmed. We dove inside, slamming the door behind us. I collapsed on the floor, gasping for air, every muscle screaming in protest. Jake's dad bombarded us with questions, but we were too exhausted and terrified to string together coherent answers. It wasn't until later, after we'd calmed down somewhat, that we were able to tell him what happened. To my surprise, he didn't seem skeptical. His face grew grave as we described the creatures. "I was hoping you boys would never have to deal with this," he said quietly. He went on to tell us that he'd had his own encounter in those woods years ago, that there were things out there that defied explanation, things that most people refused to believe in. "Promise me you'll stay out of Miller's Woods from now on," he said. We didn't need to be told twice. In the years since, I've tried to rationalize what happened that night, to tell myself it was just some kind of mass hallucination brought on by fear and exhaustion. But deep down, I know what I saw, what I heard, what I smelled. There are creatures out there that shouldn't exist, things that lurk in the dark places of the world, far from prying eyes. I count myself lucky to have escaped with my life that night, but the knowledge of what's really out there haunts me to this day. I still wake up sometimes in a cold sweat, imagining those glowing eyes peering in at me, remembering the sound of those howls and the stench of those things. So if you're ever tempted to go looking for adventure in some remote wilderness, take it from me. Some things are better left undiscovered. There are horrors in this world that the human mind simply isn't equipped to deal with. Horrors that will change you forever once you've seen them. Stay safe out there, and whatever you do, stay out of the woods at night. Story 7. As I pulled up to the cabin, I immediately got an eerie feeling. The place was run down and overgrown, like no one had been there in years. But there was an old pickup truck parked out front, so I figured the caretaker must be around somewhere. I grabbed my tools and headed inside to check out the plumbing situation. The cabin was musty and dim inside. I located the main water line and got to work, trying to ignore the cobwebs and creaky floorboards. After about an hour of tinkering, I thought I had the pressure issue resolved. I was just packing up my gear when I heard it, a deep, guttural sound coming from outside. At first, I thought it might be a bear, but it didn't sound quite right. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I hesitated, not sure if I should investigate or make a beeline for my truck. But curiosity got the better of me. I crept over to the grimy kitchen window and peered out into the overgrown yard. That's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing at the edge of the woods was the biggest, hairiest creature I've ever laid eyes on. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, covered in reddish-brown fur. For a split second, I thought maybe it was just a person in a costume, but as I stared in shock, the thing turned and looked right at me with piercing yellow eyes. I stumbled backwards, my heart pounding out of my chest. Suddenly, the whole cabin started shaking violently. Boom, boom, boom! The creature was pounding on the outer walls with massive fists. Picture frames crashed to the floor as I scrambled to get away from the windows. I was in full panic mode, convinced I was about to be ripped apart by some kind of monster. The pounding stopped as abruptly as it started. An eerie silence fell over the cabin. After a few minutes of cowering behind the couch, I worked up the courage to look outside again. The creature was gone, but I could see massive footprints in the mud where it had been standing. I was shaking like a leaf, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. It couldn't be real, right? Bigfoot was just a myth. But I knew what I saw. As I was contemplating making a run for my truck, the cabin door swung open. I nearly jumped out of my skin. It was just the caretaker, an old grizzled guy who looked like he'd been living in these woods for decades. He took one look at my pale, sweaty face and chuckled. "Ah, I see you've met our hairy neighbor," he said casually, like we were talking about a raccoon or something. I sputtered out what had happened, fully expecting him to tell me I was crazy, but he just nodded knowingly. "Yep, that big fella's been prowling these parts for years. Most folks around here have seen him at least once. Doesn't usually bother nobody, though. Just likes to make his presence known sometimes." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This guy was acting like a giant ape man in the woods was perfectly normal. But that's impossible," I stammered. "Bigfoot isn't real." The old man just shrugged. "Lots of things in these woods that city folks say ain't real. Don't mean they don't exist." He wouldn't say much more about it, just asked if I'd finished fixing the pipes. I numbly nodded, grabbed my tools, and got the hell out of there as fast as I could. That encounter changed everything for me. I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. I started reading everything I could find about Bigfoot sightings and other strange creatures. I even went back to those woods a few times, hoping to catch another glimpse. But I never saw the creature again. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I remember those piercing eyes, that nauseating smell, the sound of those massive fists pounding on the cabin. It was real, I'm sure of it. I don't expect anyone to believe me, but I know what I saw that day. There are things out there in the wilderness that defy explanation. I just hope I never come face to face with one again. I still work as a plumber, but I'm a lot more cautious about taking jobs in remote areas now. Every time I'm out in the woods, I find myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see that massive, hairy figure watching me. The memory of that day still gives me chills. I'll never forget the terror I felt when I realized I wasn't alone in those woods, and that my companion wasn't human. Sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I swear I can hear that deep, guttural growl in the distance. It's probably just my imagination playing tricks on me. At least, that's what I tell myself. But a part of me wonders, what if it isn't? What if that creature is still out there, roaming the forests, waiting for its next encounter with an unsuspecting human? I've thought about reporting what I saw to the authorities or some kind of paranormal research group, but who would believe me? I'd probably be laughed out of town. So I've kept it to myself all this time, turning the experience over and over in my mind, trying to make sense of it. One thing's for sure, I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again. Every shadow in the trees, every unexplained sound in the night, makes me wonder. Are we really alone out there? Or are there creatures beyond our understanding, watching us from the darkness? I don't have any answers. All I know is what I saw that day in the Catskills. And it's something I'll never forget, no matter how hard I try. That massive fur-covered body, those intelligent, almost human-like eyes, the raw power in those fists as they shook the entire cabin. It was terrifying, yes, but also awe-inspiring, like seeing a force of nature up close. Sometimes I catch myself hoping I'll see the creature again, as crazy as that sounds. I want proof, something tangible to show the world that I'm not crazy, that what I saw was real. But then I remember the fear, the absolute certainty that I was about to die, and I think maybe it's better left a mystery. I still take jobs out in rural areas, but I'm always on high alert now. Every snapping twig, every rustling bush sets my heart racing. I keep telling myself it was a one-time thing, that lightning doesn't strike twice. But deep down, I know that's not true. If these creatures are out there, and I'm convinced they are, then there's always a chance of another encounter. So I keep my eyes open and my wits about me. And I wonder, how many other people have stories like mine? How many have seen things in the woods that defy explanation, but are too afraid of ridicule to speak up? Maybe we're not as alone out there as we think. Maybe the wilderness holds secrets we're only beginning to understand. All I know is that day changed me forever. It opened my eyes to possibilities I never would have considered before. And while part of me wishes I could go back to my old, comfortable worldview, I know that's impossible now. Once you've seen behind the curtain, there's no going back. All you can do is move forward, eyes wide open, ready for whatever might be lurking in the shadows. Story 8. The morning started off perfectly. Clear blue skies, a light breeze, ideal conditions for ballooning. We arrived at the launch site just as the sun was peeking over the mountains. The pilot, a friendly older guy named Tom, greeted us warmly and started going over safety procedures. I was barely listening, too busy craning my neck to watch the massive balloon being inflated. Finally, we climbed into the basket and lifted off. The sensation was incredible, like we were floating on air. Grandpa and I stood side by side, pointing out landmarks far below and snapping photos. Tom expertly guided us over dense evergreen forests and winding rivers. The view was breathtaking. We'd been airborne for about an hour when things took a shocking turn. As we drifted over a particularly remote stretch of wilderness, movement on the ground caught my eye. At first I thought it was just a bear or something, but as we got closer, I realized this was way too big to be any normal animal. My jaw dropped as I made out the unmistakable shape of an enormous, hairy, humanoid figure. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, with a massive barrel chest and long, powerful limbs. The creature was covered in reddish-brown fur from head to toe. "Grandpa, look!" I hissed urgently, grabbing his arm. He followed my gaze and let out a shocked gasp. "What in God's name?" he muttered. Even Tom the pilot seemed stunned into silence as we all stared in disbelief at the scene unfolding below us. The creature was standing at the base of a huge pine tree, easily 60 or 70 feet tall. As we watched, it wrapped its enormous arms around the trunk and began to pull. At first, nothing happened, but then, with a loud cracking sound, the roots started to tear free from the earth. In one fluid motion, this thing ripped an entire full-grown tree right out of the ground like it was plucking a daisy. It hefted the massive pine above its head, branches and all, as if it weighed nothing. The raw strength on display was unbelievable. I fumbled for my camera with shaking hands, desperate to document what we were seeing. This had to be Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it. Living, breathing proof that these creatures actually exist. The being suddenly froze, as if sensing our presence. It slowly turned its head and looked directly up at our balloon. Even from that distance, I could see its eyes gleaming with intelligence. A chill ran down my spine. In a burst of speed that seemed impossible for something so large, it took off running through the forest, still carrying the entire tree above its head. It moved with a fluid grace, bounding over fallen logs and weaving between trees without slowing. Within seconds, it had vanished into the shadows of the forest, leaving only a swath of destroyed vegetation in its wake. The three of us in the balloon basket stood in stunned silence for several long moments. I think we were all trying to process what we'd just witnessed. Did you both see that too? I finally managed to ask in a shaky voice. Grandpa nodded gravely. I saw it all right, though I can scarcely believe my own eyes. Tom the pilot was white as a sheet. In all my years flying these skies, I've never... He trailed off, shaking his head in disbelief. As the initial shock wore off, excitement began to set in. We had just seen indisputable proof of Bigfoot, and I had photos. This was going to change everything. Tom brought us in for a landing as soon as he could find a suitable clearing. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely work the balloon basket latch. As soon as we touched down, I wanted to sprint into town and tell everyone what we'd seen, but Grandpa urged caution. "Now hold on there, kiddo," he said, putting a restraining hand on my shoulder. "We need to think this through carefully. You can bet the government and who knows who else would love to get their hands on evidence like this. We can't just go blabbing to everyone." He had a point, so we agreed to keep things quiet for the time being. Tom said he knew a journalist friend we could trust who might be able to help us figure out next steps. We made plans to meet up with him the next day to go over the photos and footage. But things only got weirder from there. When we tried to call Tom that evening to confirm plans, the number he'd given us was disconnected. We drove out to the balloon launch site the next morning, but there was no sign of him or his equipment. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. I took my camera to a local shop to get the film developed, making up a story about wildlife photos so as not to arouse suspicion. But when I went to pick them up, they told me there had been some kind of accident in the darkroom, and all my film had been destroyed. It was beyond frustrating, the most incredible discovery of the century, and all our evidence had disappeared. I started to wonder if Grandpa was right about the government covering things up. It seemed too much of a coincidence. In the weeks and months that followed, I scoured newspapers and online forums for any similar sightings in the area. I even made a few trips back out to those woods, though I never saw anything out of the ordinary again. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, but then I remember the awe and terror I felt, watching that massive creature tear a 70-foot tree from the ground with its bare hands. The way it moved with such unnatural speed and grace, the intelligence in its eyes as it looked right at us. I know deep in my bones that what I saw that day was real. I still have trouble sleeping some nights, remembering how close we came to an encounter with that thing. What if our balloon had drifted lower, or if it had decided to attack? We would have been completely helpless. To this day, I've never told anyone outside my family about what we saw. I'm not sure anyone would believe me anyway, but I know the truth. Bigfoot is real, and it's out there somewhere in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. I only hope that someday there will be conclusive proof so the world can know what we know. Until then, I'll keep searching for answers and hoping for another glimpse of the extraordinary creature I saw on that fateful graduation day. The memory of its raw power and otherworldly presence will stay with me forever. Somewhere out there, Bigfoot roams free, and I consider myself incredibly lucky, and maybe a little cursed, to be one of the few humans to have seen it with my own eyes. Story 9. It started out as a normal ride. I saddled up Rusty around 6:30 p.m. as usual, and we set off down our usual trail. The air was crisp with that perfect autumn chill. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, I guided Rusty towards the old wooden bridge that crosses Miller Creek. We've gone over that bridge hundreds of times before without issue. But this time as we approached, Rusty suddenly tensed up. His ears pricked forward, and he started snorting and pawing at the ground nervously. I tried to calm him down, speaking softly and patting his neck, but he was clearly spooked by something. The hairs on the back of my own neck started to prickle. I dismounted and led Rusty across the bridge on foot, figuring he'd feel more secure that way. He was still jumpy, his eyes darting around wildly. I scanned the area, but couldn't see anything out of the ordinary in the fading light. Once we were across, I got back in the saddle and we continued on, though Rusty remained on edge. As we rounded a bend in the road, the trees opened up to reveal a large field on our right. In the silvery moonlight, I could make out the fence line running along the edge of the pasture. And that's when I saw them. Two massive, hair-covered figures were standing just on the other side of the barbed wire fence, maybe 50 yards away. My breath caught in my throat as I took in their hulking silhouettes. The larger one had to be at least 7 or 8 feet tall, with the smaller one not far behind at 6 or 7 feet. They were unmistakably bipedal, but their proportions were all wrong to be human. I froze in the saddle, desperately hoping they hadn't noticed us. But then I saw their heads turn in our direction. Even from that distance, I could feel their eyes locked onto us. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The creatures seemed to be sniffing the air, their heads tilted back slightly. Did they catch our scent? I don't know how long we all stayed like that, locked in a silent standoff. It felt like an eternity, but was probably only a matter of seconds. Suddenly, Rusty let out a terrified whinny and reared up. I barely managed to stay in the saddle as he spun around and took off at a full gallop back the way we'd come. I didn't even try to slow him down. I was just as desperate to get away as he was. Wind whipped past my face as we tore down the road. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely keep hold of the reins. Only once did I dare to glance back over my shoulder. In the distance, I could see the two creatures loping along the fence line, moving with surprising speed and grace for their size. But they weren't pursuing us. They seemed content to watch us flee. When we finally thundered into the barn, I was shaking like a leaf. I quickly unsaddled Rusty and got him settled in his stall, murmuring soothing words even as my own mind raced. What in the world had we just seen? I stumbled back to the house in a daze, looking over my shoulder every few steps. Sleep was out of the question that night. I paced around, jumping at every little sound outside. As soon as the sun came up, I was on the phone to my closest neighbor, Tom. "Tom, you're not going to believe what happened to me last night," I blurted out as soon as he answered. I poured out the whole story, my words tumbling over each other. There was a long pause when I finished. Then Tom said quietly, "You know, Jenny down the road told me she saw something similar last month. Said she thought she was going crazy." My jaw dropped. "Are you serious? Why didn't anyone say anything?" "Who's gonna believe it?" Tom replied with a humorless chuckle. "But now that you mention it, I've been hearing weird noises at night lately, and my dogs have been acting real strange, barking at nothing." We talked for a while longer, piecing together other odd occurrences in the area. Livestock going missing, strange tracks found in soft ground, eerie howls in the night that didn't sound quite animal or human. In the year since that night, I've done a lot of research into Bigfoot sightings. I've read countless reports from all over the country describing creatures just like what I saw. It's both comforting and unsettling to know I'm not alone in my experience. I still ride rusty, but never after dark anymore, and I avoid that stretch of road entirely. Sometimes when I'm out in the yard at twilight, I catch myself scanning the tree line, wondering if those eyes are out there watching me. I don't know what those creatures were or where they came from, but I know what I saw that night was real. It's changed the way I look at the world around me. There are things out there we don't understand, hidden just beyond the edges of our everyday lives. And sometimes, if we're not careful, we stumble right into their path. I've told a few trusted friends about what happened, but this is the first time I'm sharing the full story publicly. I know some people won't believe me. Hell, some days I can hardly believe it myself. But I know what I saw. And I have a feeling I'm not the only one in these parts with a story to tell. So, if you're ever out riding near Benton as the sun goes down, keep your eyes open and your wits about you. You never know what might be watching from the shadows. Story 10. I still remember that day in January 1811 like it was yesterday. The biting cold, the pristine snow-covered peaks of the Rocky Mountains looming all around us. I was leading an expedition for the Northwest Company, surveying the rugged terrain near what's now Jasper, Alberta. We'd been out for weeks, mapping the wilderness, but nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to encounter. It was early morning when I first spotted them. Massive tracks in the fresh snow, unlike anything I'd ever seen before. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but as I got closer, I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the freezing temperature. The footprints were enormous, a good 14 inches long, with 4 distinct toes, each one 3-4 inches wide. The depth of the impressions in the snow spoke to something incredibly heavy. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. A bear, maybe. But I'd tracked plenty of bears in my years as a surveyor, and this was something else entirely. I called over the rest of my team to take a look. Their reactions mirrored my own, a mix of awe, confusion, and more than a little fear. We stood there in silence for a long moment, the only sound the whistle of wind through the pines. "What do you make of it, sir?" one of my men finally asked, his voice hushed. I shook my head, at a loss for words. "I'm not sure," I admitted. "I've never seen tracks like these before." We decided to follow the trail, see where it might lead us. As we trudged through the snow, following those massive footprints, I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush had us on edge. The tracks led us deeper into a densely wooded valley. The trees grew thick here, ancient pines towering overhead, blocking out much of the weak winter sunlight. It was eerily quiet. No birds singing, no small animals scurrying about, just the crunch of our own footsteps in the snow and the pounding of my heart in my ears. As we rounded a bend in the trail, I caught a whiff of something musky. A strong animal odor that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I held up a hand, signaling the others to stop and stay quiet. That's when we heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not quite a bear, not quite a wolf, but something other. My men were visibly shaken. I saw hands instinctively going to rifle stocks, eyes darting nervously from tree to tree. I tried to project an air of calm authority, but inside I was just as terrified as they were. "Stay alert," I whispered. Whatever made those tracks could still be nearby. We pressed on, following the trail deeper into the valley. The footprints were fresher here, the snow barely settled in the deep impressions. Whatever had made them couldn't be far ahead. Suddenly, one of my men let out a strangled cry. I whirled around to see him pointing with a shaking hand. There, through a gap in the trees, maybe 50 yards away, I caught a glimpse of something. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark, shaggy fur. For a split second, our eyes met. Deep, intelligent eyes set in a face that was somehow both ape-like and disturbingly human. Then it was gone, melting into the shadows of the forest with surprising speed and silence for a creature of its size. We stood there, frozen in shock and disbelief. None of us spoke. What was there to say? We'd just seen something that shouldn't exist, something that defied explanation. After what felt like an eternity, I found my voice. We should head back to camp," I managed to croak out. No one argued. The trek back was tense and silent. Every shadow seemed to hold potential danger, every sound a possible threat. When we finally reached the relative safety of our camp, the relief was palpable. That night, huddled around the fire, we tried to make sense of what we'd seen. Some of the local natives who were part of our expedition had their own theories. They spoke of legends passed down through generations, of a creature they called Sasquatch, a giant ape-like being that roamed the mountains. Others suggested it might have been a young mammoth, though that seemed unlikely given what we'd seen. For my part, I was reluctant to put a name to it. How could I explain something I couldn't understand myself? As I sat there staring into the flames, I wrestled with what to write in my expedition journal. I was a man of science, after all. How could I record something so fantastic? In the end, I decided to stick to the facts, the size of the tracks, their unusual shape. I made no mention of our brief encounter in the woods. Some things I decided were better left unwritten. In the days that followed, we continued our survey work, but there was an undeniable tension in the air. Every unexplained sound had us on edge, every shadowy form in the trees a potential threat. We never saw the creature again, but its presence loomed large in our minds. As we finally packed up camp and headed back to civilization, I found myself both relieved and strangely disappointed. Part of me had hoped for another encounter, a chance to confirm what we'd seen and maybe understand it better. But perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. In the years since, I've often thought back to that day in the Rockies. I've pored over my old journals, reread my account of those strange tracks. I've heard other stories too, trappers and traders with their own tales of giant ape-like creatures in the wilderness. But nothing quite compares to what we experienced that January day. It was a reminder that even in this age of exploration and scientific advancement, there are still things in this world that defy explanation, things that make you question everything you thought you knew. To this day, I'm not sure what we encountered in those snow-covered mountains. Was it some unknown species of animal, a creature of legend come to life, or something else entirely? I don't have the answers. But I know what I saw, what we all saw, and it's a memory that will stay with me for the rest of my days. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I find myself transported back to that moment. The icy wind, the looming trees, and those intelligent eyes staring back at me from a face that shouldn't exist. And I wonder, what if we'd followed it further? What if we'd managed to make contact? What other secrets might those mountains hold? But then I remind myself that some questions are better left unanswered. Some mysteries are meant to remain just that, mysteries. And perhaps that's for the best. After all, what would our world be without a little wonder, a little uncertainty? It's experiences like these that remind us how vast and unknowable our world truly is. As I sit here now, an old man looking back on a life of exploration and discovery, I can say with certainty that nothing in all my years of surveying and mapping ever came close to the impact of that encounter. It changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. To those who might read this and scoff, who might dismiss it as the ramblings of an old fool or the exaggerations of a tale grown tall with time, I say this: there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy. Keep an open mind, and who knows what wonders or terrors you might encounter. As for me, I'll always have that day in the Rockies. The day I came face to face with the unknown and lived to tell the tale. It's a reminder that even in a world we think we've mapped and measured, there are still wild places, still mysteries waiting to be uncovered. And who knows, maybe someday someone will finally solve the riddle of those massive tracks in the snow and the creature that made them. Until then, I'll keep wondering, keep questioning, because that's what explorers do. We push boundaries, we seek the unknown, and sometimes, just sometimes, the unknown pushes back. Word count 1526. Story 11. As I made my way along a secluded trail, I heard some rustling in the bushes ahead. At first I thought it was just a deer or maybe a bear, but as I cautiously approached, I realized it was something much larger and much stranger. There, not 50 feet away, was a massive humanoid creature, unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It was crouched down, methodically stripping leaves off tree branches with its teeth. I froze in my tracks, heart pounding, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The thing was enormous, easily 6 feet tall even in its hunched position, and I'd estimate it weighed at least 300 pounds. It was covered in coarse, dark brown fur with silvery streaks throughout. But what struck me most were its strangely human-like features. Its face, while definitely ape-like, had an uncanny resemblance to a person. The nose was flatter and wider than a human's, but still distinctly nose-shaped. The eyes were deep-set under a prominent brow, glinting with what looked like intelligence. Its mouth and jaw were larger and more pronounced than ours, suited for powerful chewing. One of the most unsettling things was its hands. They were massive, easily twice the size of a man's, with opposable thumbs. As it plucked leaves and berries, I could see how dexterous those huge fingers were. Its arms were incredibly long, hanging down almost to its knees. I stood there paralyzed, afraid to move a muscle. My mind was reeling, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with anything I knew to exist. Was this some kind of undiscovered primate, an escaped circus animal, or something else entirely? Suddenly the creature's head snapped up and it locked eyes with me. I felt a jolt of terror course through my body. Those eyes, they were so eerily human-like. Not the blank stare of an animal, but filled with obvious intelligence and curiosity. For several heart-stopping moments, we just stared at each other. I couldn't look away from its gaze. Then it made a sound I'll never forget. A deep, guttural vocalization that was somewhere between a growl and a laugh. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Slowly, the creature rose to its full height. Standing upright, it was even more imposing. Its head nearly brushed the lower branches of the trees. I noticed its feet were massive, easily twice the size of mine, with grayish-brown leathery skin on the soles. My legs were trembling, but I knew I needed to slowly back away. As I took a tentative step backwards, it suddenly lunged forward with shocking speed. I turned and ran blindly through the forest, crashing through bushes and leaping over fallen logs. I could hear it crashing through the woods behind me, moving far faster than something that size should be able to. Branches whipped at my face as I sprinted headlong down the mountain, fueled by sheer terror. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I finally burst out of the tree line onto a small clearing. I bent over, gasping for breath, and realized I couldn't hear it pursuing me anymore. Cautiously, I turned and peered back into the dense forest. There was no sign of the creature. As my panic subsided, curiosity began to take over. What on earth had I just encountered? I knew I should probably hightail it out of there, but I felt compelled to try to find some proof of what I'd seen. Warily, I made my way back up the mountain, alert for any sound or movement. When I neared the area where I'd first spotted the creature, I started examining the ground closely. To my amazement, I found huge, bare footprints pressed into the soft earth. easily 20 inches long and half as wide. As I continued searching the area, I came across several piles of droppings, far larger than anything a bear would leave. Hesitantly, I poked at one with a stick. There were no signs of insect parts or bones. It seemed to be composed entirely of plant matter. A bit further on, I found what looked like a crude nest near the base of a large tree. It was a flattened oval area where the grass and ferns had been pressed down, forming a depression big enough for a very large animal to curl up in. I spent the next couple hours meticulously searching the area, but found no other conclusive evidence. As the sun began to set, I reluctantly headed back down the mountain, my mind whirling. In the days and weeks that followed, I obsessively researched anything I could find about similar sightings or unknown primates. I even reached out to some experts in biology and anthropology, but was mostly met with skepticism. To this day, I still can't explain what I encountered that autumn afternoon in Jasper. Was it truly some undiscovered species, a creature out of legend, or something even stranger? I don't know if I'll ever have answers, but the memory of those intelligent eyes staring into mine will haunt me for the rest of my days. I've gone back to that area several times over the years, hoping to catch another glimpse or find more evidence, but I've never seen anything quite like it again. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I close my eyes and can still vividly see every detail of that massive hair-covered form. The memory is burned into my brain. I know many people won't believe my story. Honestly, sometimes I can hardly believe it myself. But I know what I saw that day. It was real, and it was like nothing known to science. Whatever it was, that encounter changed me. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there are still mysteries in this world, things beyond our current understanding. I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again. Sometimes when I'm out hiking, I'll catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye or hear a twig snap in the distance. My heart will race as I scan the tree line, wondering if I'll see that hulking form again. Part of me hopes I do, while another part dreads it. I've mostly kept this story to myself over the years. Who would believe me? But I felt compelled to finally share my experience. Maybe someone else out there has seen something similar. Maybe by speaking up we can finally shed some light on whatever these creatures are. All I know is that something extraordinary exists out there in the wilds of Alberta. I was lucky enough, or perhaps unlucky enough, to come face to face with it, and the encounter has left me with far more questions than answers. Story 12. I was just a young guy back in 1960, working my first real job on the construction of the Bighorn Dam. It was hard, grueling work, but I was proud to be contributing to such a massive project. Little did I know that one August day would change my life forever. It started off as a typical morning. The sun was just starting to peek over the mountains as my crew and I arrived at the job site. There were 3 of us assigned to work on a section of the dam near a deep ravine. Me, Bob, and Mike. We'd become pretty good buddies over the past few months of working together. As we got our equipment ready, I noticed Bob seemed a bit on edge. "You all right?" I asked him. He just shook his head and mumbled something about having a weird feeling. I didn't think much of it at the time. If only I'd known what was coming. We'd been working for a couple hours when I heard Mike let out a yell. I turned to look at him and saw his face had gone white as a sheet. He was pointing frantically toward the ravine. That's when I saw it. At first, my brain couldn't even process what I was seeing. There was a figure emerging from the trees on the other side of the ravine. But it was massive, impossibly huge. As it moved into the clearing, I realized with dawning horror that it had to be at least 15 feet tall. I froze, unable to move or speak. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but covered in dark, matted hair. The arms were impossibly long, nearly dragging on the ground, and the face God, I'll never forget that face as long as I live. It was almost human-like, but distorted. The brow was heavy and pronounced, the jaw massive and protruding. But it was the eyes that haunted me most. They weren't the eyes of some mindless beast. There was an intelligence there, an awareness. And as it paused at the edge of the ravine, those eyes locked directly onto us. I don't know how long we all stood there, paralyzed with fear. It felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then Bob started screaming. It was a high, hysterical sound that shattered the unnatural silence. The creature's head snapped toward Bob. In two massive strides, it had crossed half the ravine. That's when survival instinct finally kicked in, and we all started running. I've never run so fast in my life. My lungs were burning and my legs felt like jelly, but sheer terror kept me going. I risked a glance back and immediately regretted it. The thing was crossing the ravine with unnatural speed and agility, leaping from rock to rock. We made it to one of the work trucks and piled in, Bob still howling in terror. Mike fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so bad he could barely get them in the ignition. I kept my eyes locked on the rearview mirror, watching in horror as the massive figure emerged from the ravine and started loping across the open ground toward us. The engine roared to life and Mike slammed it into gear. We fishtailed wildly as he floored it, spraying gravel everywhere. I watched as the creature rapidly fell behind, its inhuman stride no match for the truck's speed. We didn't stop driving until we reached the main work camp. By then, we were all shaking and drenched in sweat. Mike pulled over and we just sat there in silence for a long time, trying to process what we'd just experienced. Finally, Bob spoke up in a trembling voice. "What? What the hell was that thing?" Mike shook his head slowly. "I don't know, but I know what I saw. That wasn't human, and it sure as hell wasn't any kind of animal I've ever seen before." I nodded in agreement, still unable to find my voice. The image of that creature was burned into my mind. The massive size, the inhuman speed and agility, and those eyes. We debated whether to tell anyone what we'd seen. Who would even believe us? But word got around camp quick that something had spooked us bad. And that's when the rumors started flying. Some of the local workers pulled us aside later that day. They told us in hushed voices about legends of giant, hairy creatures that roamed these mountains. Said there had been sightings going back generations. One old-timer even claimed there was a family of 4 of the creatures living in the area. Said his granddaddy had encountered them decades ago. I don't know if I believe all that, but after what I saw that day, I can't completely dismiss it either. The company bosses tried to laugh it off when they heard, said we must have seen a bear and let our imaginations run wild. But they seemed awfully eager to hush up the whole thing. Makes me wonder if they knew more than they were letting on. We went back to work the next day, but things were different. We were always looking over our shoulders, jumping at every snapped twig or rustle in the bushes. The easy camaraderie of the work crew was gone, replaced by an edgy tension. I had trouble sleeping for weeks after. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing's face. Those intelligent, aware eyes boring into me. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, the memory as vivid now as it was back then. I've tried to rationalize it over the years. Tell myself it was just some kind of bear, or that my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I know what I saw that day was real. And I know it wasn't any normal animal. I've never gone camping or hiking since then. Can't stand being in the wilderness, always feeling like I'm being watched. Some of the guys at the dam ended up quitting, unable to shake the fear. I stuck it out, but I was damn glad when that job was finally over. I don't know what's out there in those mountains. Maybe it was some unknown species, or maybe, well, I try not to think too hard about the other possibilities. All I know is that day changed me. made me realize the world is a whole lot stranger and scarier than we like to think. Sometimes I wonder if that creature is still out there, roaming those remote hills. And I wonder if anyone else has seen it over the years. But mostly, I just try to forget. Try to convince myself it was all just a bad dream. But then I'll catch a glimpse of something on the news, some blurry photo or shaky video, and it all comes rushing back. I've never told this story publicly before. Figured people would just think I was crazy or making it up. But I know what I saw that day. And I know Bob and Mike saw it too. Whatever that thing was, it was real. And the memory of it will haunt me for the rest of my days. Story 13. I was just a kid back in '68, but that summer camping trip to Banff is seared into my memory like it happened yesterday. My folks had this old station wagon packed to the gills with gear as we set out from Calgary, me and my little sister bouncing around in the back seat without a care in the world. Dad was always big on these wilderness adventures, wanting to toughen us up and show us the raw beauty of nature. Mom went along with it, but you could tell she'd rather be back home with her soaps and air conditioning. The drive up to the park was long, but the views were breathtaking. Towering peaks, pristine forests, glacial lakes that looked like they were glowing. We finally made it to our campsite late in the afternoon and got everything set up. Dad was in his element, showing us how to pitch the tent and build a fire. Mom mostly fussed over keeping us from getting dirty or hurt. That first night around the campfire is when Dad started in with his usual spooky stories. He loved spinning yarns about the mysteries of the wilderness, ghosts, cryptids, all that stuff. This time he was going on about Bigfoot sightings in the area. I remember rolling my eyes, thinking it was just more of his tall tales, if only I'd known what was coming. The next day, we set out on a hike up towards the Columbia icefield. It was a tough slog for my 10-year-old legs, but the scenery was incredible. Jagged mountains, sprawling glaciers, tumbling waterfalls. We stopped for lunch on this ridge overlooking a steep, forested slope. That's when everything changed. I noticed it first, movement in the tree line below us. At first I thought it was just a bear or something, but as I pointed it out to Dad, we all realized this was way bigger than any bear. This thing emerged from the forest and started loping up the mountainside with these huge bounding strides. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, and covered in shaggy black fur. The way it moved was just unreal, so fast and agile for its size, eat up the distance like it was nothing. We all just sat there frozen, trying to process what we were seeing. Dad fumbled for his binoculars, hands shaking. When he finally got them focused, I heard him let out this strangled gasp. "Sweet Jesus," he whispered. Mom started praying under her breath. My little sister started crying. Through the binoculars, I could make out more details. The creature's arms were immensely long and muscular, swinging with each powerful stride. Its head was shaped weirdly, kind of conical with no real neck, but what really got me were the eyes. Even from that distance I could see them, dark and intelligent, taking in its surroundings as it moved. It covered the entire slope in what seemed like seconds, vanishing over the ridge above us. We all just sat there in stunned silence for I don't know how long. Finally, Dad snapped out of it, grabbing our stuff and herding us back down the trail. He kept looking over his shoulder, pushing us to move faster. Mom was in hysterics, certain the thing was going to come after us. We made it back to the campsite and Dad immediately started packing up the car. Within an hour we were on the road, heading home days early. The whole drive back, nobody said a word. We were all lost in our own thoughts, trying to rationalize what we'd seen. In the years since, I've gone over that day in my head countless times. I've read everything I could find about Bigfoot and other cryptids. I've even gone back to Banff a few times, hoping to catch another glimpse, but nothing's ever come close to explaining what we saw that day. I know how it sounds. Believe me, I've heard all the skepticism and ridicule over the years, but I know what I saw. That wasn't a bear, or a person in a suit, or some kind of mass hallucination. There was something out there in those mountains, something that shouldn't exist, but does. Sometimes late at night, I still see those eyes in my mind, watching, aware, almost human, but not quite. It's like they knew we were there, knew we were watching it. And sometimes I wonder, was it studying us just as intently as we were studying it? I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, half the time I'm not sure I believe it myself. But I know what I saw that day in Banff, and I know that there are things out there in the wilderness that defy explanation. Things that remind us that for all our technology and civilized comforts, we're still just visitors in the wild places of the world. That day changed me. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there's more to this world than we understand. I've spent my life chasing that feeling, that sense of awe and terror and wonder all mixed together. I've hiked countless miles of backcountry, always with one eye on the tree line, hoping for another glimpse of the impossible. But nothing's ever come close to that day in Banff. Sometimes I think maybe it's better that way. Maybe some mysteries are meant to stay unsolved. But a part of me will always be that awestruck kid on that mountainside, watching something straight out of legend, bound across the landscape like it owned it. I don't know if I'll ever get answers, but I do know this. I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again. And whenever I'm out in the backcountry and the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, I wonder, is it out there, watching, waiting? I may never know for sure, but that lingering question, that possibility, has shaped my entire life since that summer day over 50 years ago. So that's my story. Believe it or don't, I've long since stopped caring what others think. I know what I saw, and I know that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that remind us how little we truly understand about the world around us. And maybe that's okay. Maybe it's good to be reminded now and then that we don't have all the answers, that there's still mystery and wonder out there if we're brave enough to look for it. Story 14. I was one of 3 prospectors working near Kananaskis Lake back in the summer of '69. We'd been out there for weeks, panning for gold and surveying the area. It was hard, dirty work, but we were young and full of dreams about striking it rich. That day started like any other. We woke up at dawn, had some coffee and canned beans for breakfast, then set out to continue our work along the creek. The sun was beating down hard by midday, so we decided to take a break and head back to camp for lunch. As we approached our tents, I noticed something odd in the tree line about 50 yards away. At first I thought it was just a shadow or trick of the light, but then it moved. I froze in my tracks and grabbed Bill's arm. "You see that?" I whispered. He squinted in the direction I was pointing. That's when it stepped fully into view, and my blood ran cold. It was massive, at least 7 or 8 feet tall, covered in dark matted fur. But strangest of all, it was clearly female, with prominent breasts visible beneath the hair. "Holy shit," Tom breathed beside me. "Is that what I think it is?" I couldn't speak. I'd heard stories about Bigfoot, of course, but I'd always assumed they were just tall tales. Yet here was living proof right in front of us. My mind reeled as I tried to process what I was seeing. The creature hadn't seemed to notice us yet. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, swaying slightly. Then it started exhibiting the most bizarre behavior. It began rhythmically moving its arms up and down, almost like it was trying to fly. But most unsettling was the sound, a loud, chattering noise that I realized was coming from its mouth. It was gnashing and grinding its teeth together rapidly. A chill ran down my spine. There was something so unnatural and wrong about the way it was moving. This wasn't just some undiscovered primate. There was an otherworldly quality to it that filled me with a deep, primal dread. "We need to get out of here," Bill said urgently. But I felt frozen in place, unable to look away from the grotesque spectacle before us. Suddenly, the creature's head snapped in our direction. I'll never forget those eyes, dark and glittering with a terrible intelligence. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then it let out a bone-chilling howl that seemed to vibrate through my whole body, that finally spurred us into action. We turned and ran back the way we came, stumbling over rocks and roots in our panic. I could hear heavy footsteps pounding behind us, getting closer. The stench of wet fur and something rotten filled my nostrils. "Split up!" Tom yelled. We veered off in different directions. I darted between two large boulders, wedging myself into a crevice. My lungs burned as I tried to quiet my ragged breathing. For several agonizing minutes, all I could hear was my own pounding heartbeat. Then a twig snapped nearby. I peered out and caught a glimpse of matted fur moving through the trees. It was sniffing the air, searching. I pressed myself further into the rocks, willing myself to disappear. The creature let out another of those awful howls. This time it sounded frustrated, angry. But it was further away now. I'm not sure how long I stayed hidden there. It felt like hours. Eventually I heard Bill's voice calling my name. Cautiously, I emerged from my hiding spot. Bill and Tom were both there, wide-eyed and shaken, but unharmed. "Did you see where it went?" I asked. They shook their heads. "Lost sight of it after we split up," Tom said. "But I could hear it crashing through the woods for a while." We made our way back to camp, jumping at every snapping twig or rustling leaf. The tents were still standing, but our supplies were scattered everywhere. Deep claw marks scored the trees around the clearing. "We need to get the hell out of here," Bill said. No one argued. We hastily packed up what we could salvage and started the long hike back to civilization. That night, as we huddled around our meager fire, miles away from where we'd encountered the creature, we tried to make sense of what we'd seen. None of us could explain the bizarrely human-like qualities mixed with animalistic features, or that strange, ritualistic movement and teeth-gnashing. "Maybe it was sick or injured somehow," Tom suggested, but that didn't feel right. There had been a purpose to its actions, unsettling as they were. In the years since, I've gone over that encounter countless times in my mind. I've read everything I could find about Bigfoot sightings and theories, but nothing quite matches what we saw that day. The female appearance, the size, the odd behaviors, it all points to something beyond just an undiscovered species. Sometimes I wonder if we stumbled upon something not of this world, or if there are things in the deep wilderness that defy categorization. I've never gone back to Kananaskis Lake. The memory of those glittering eyes and that howl still haunts my dreams. Whatever we saw out there, I hope it stays in the wild places where humans rarely tread. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. For a long time, I didn't tell anyone about what happened. Who would believe such an outlandish story? But as I've gotten older, I feel a need to share this experience, if only so others might be prepared if they ever encounter something similar in the wilderness. I still go camping and hiking occasionally, but I'm always hyper-aware of my surroundings now. Every shadow in the trees could be hiding something unnatural. Every snapping twig might herald the approach of some impossible creature. The encounter changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. It shattered my understanding of what's possible in this world. And it left me with a deep unease about what other secrets might be lurking in the dark corners of our planet. Sometimes I wish I could go back to my old life, when Bigfoot was just a fun campfire story and the woods held no real terror. But you can't unsee something like that. You can't unknow the truth once it's stared you in the face with wild, intelligent eyes. So I carry this secret knowledge with me, and I wonder how many others out there have similar stories they're afraid to share, How many impossible things are hiding just beyond the veil of our everyday reality? All I know for certain is that there are things in this world beyond our understanding. And sometimes, if you venture too far into the wilderness, you might just catch a terrifying glimpse of them. So be careful out there. And if you hear something moving in the woods that sounds just a little too big to be natural, don't stick around to investigate. Run. Run as fast and as far as you can. You might just save your life and your sanity. Story 15. I was just a kid back in '72, but that summer changed everything I thought I knew about the world. It was August 4th, a day I'll never forget as long as I live. My family had a cabin up near High Level, Alberta, way up north where the wilderness stretches as far as the eye can see. We'd go there every summer to fish and explore, but this trip was different. I woke up early that morning, eager to go check my fishing lines down by the river. The air was crisp and cool as I made my way through the woods. Everything seemed normal at first, birds chirping, squirrels scampering about. But as I got closer to the riverbank, an eerie silence fell over the forest. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something felt off. When I reached the edge of the trees, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, stretching out before me in the soft mud of the riverbank, was a trail of the biggest footprints I'd ever seen. My heart started racing as I approached to get a closer look. These weren't bear tracks or any other animal print I recognized. They were huge, easily over 15 inches long, and distinctly foot-shaped, with 5 toes clearly visible. I crouched down to examine them, my mind reeling. The prints were deep, like whatever made them was incredibly heavy. And they weren't just a few isolated tracks. The trail stretched on for what looked like miles, disappearing around a bend in the river. I noticed how the toes were positioned differently in some prints, almost like whatever made them had been walking naturally. At first I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an elaborate hoax, but who would go to such lengths way out here in the middle of nowhere? And how could they fake print so perfectly in this hard-packed riverbed? The more I studied the tracks, the more my skepticism faded. These looked real, too real. I ran back to the cabin as fast as my legs could carry me, bursting through the door and babbling to my parents about what I'd found. They were skeptical at first, but something in my wide-eyed, trembling demeanor must have convinced them to come take a look. We hiked back down to the river together. I'll never forget the looks on their faces when they saw those massive footprints for themselves. My dad, always the rational one, kept trying to come up with explanations, but even he seemed shaken. Word spread quickly. By that afternoon, dozens of locals had come to see the tracks for themselves. I overheard snippets of hushed conversations. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, monster. The theories flew, each more outlandish than the last. But standing there, staring at those impossible prints, even the craziest ideas didn't seem so far-fetched anymore. As the day wore on, my initial excitement gave way to a gnawing fear. If something that big was out there in these woods, were we safe? I kept imagining some massive, hairy beast lurking just beyond the tree line, watching us. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. That night, huddled in my sleeping bag, I barely slept a wink. The cabin suddenly felt so small and vulnerable. I kept picturing those huge footprints and wondering what kind of creature could have made them. In the pitch blackness, my imagination ran wild with terrifying possibilities. Just before dawn, I was jolted awake by a sound that made my blood run cold. A long, low howl echoing through the trees. It wasn't like any animal call I'd ever heard before. It was deep and guttural, almost human-like, but not quite, and it sounded close, too close. I lay there frozen, hardly daring to breathe. The howl came again, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps crunching through the underbrush. Something big was moving out there in the darkness, Suddenly, a massive shadow passed by the window, just for a split second, but I saw it clear as day, a hulking, ape-like silhouette easily 8 feet tall. I wanted to scream, to wake my parents, but terror had stolen my voice. The footsteps circled the cabin, growing fainter as whatever it was moved away. As soon as the forest fell silent again, I bolted from my bed and shook my parents awake, sobbing and babbling about what I'd seen. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, jumping at every little sound. When morning finally came, we packed up and left immediately. I begged my parents never to bring us back to that cabin again. In the days that followed, news of the tracks spread like wildfire. Researchers and cryptozoologists flocked to the area. Plaster casts were made. The tracks were measured and photographed extensively. Hundreds of people came to see them for themselves. But just as quickly as it all started, the fervor died down. No conclusive evidence was ever found beyond the tracks themselves. No hair samples, no clear photos or video. The creature that made those prints seemed to vanish back into the wilderness as mysteriously as it had appeared. 50 years have passed since that summer, but I've never been able to shake the memory of those massive footprints or that terrifying night at the cabin. I've read every book, watched every documentary I could find about Bigfoot and Sasquatch. I've even gone on a few expeditions myself over the years, hoping to find answers. But to this day, I'm left with more questions than anything else. What really made those tracks? What was that thing I saw outside our cabin that night? I may never know for sure. But one thing's certain. My encounter that summer shattered my understanding of what's possible in this world. There are things out there in the wilderness that defy explanation, and sometimes it's better not to go looking for them. Story 16. I was 28 years old at the time, working as a forest ranger in the Bighorn National Forest in Wyoming. It was early October, and I was doing a late-night patrol near the Bighorn Dam. The air was crisp and cool, and a nearly full moon cast an eerie glow over the landscape. I'd made this drive hundreds of times before, but something felt different that night. There was an unusual stillness in the air, like the forest was holding its breath. As I rounded a bend in the road, my headlights suddenly illuminated 2 massive figures standing in the middle of the road about 50 yards ahead. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching on the pavement. For a moment I thought I was hallucinating. What I saw before me simply couldn't be real. 2 enormous, hair-covered creatures were staring directly at my truck. They had to be at least 12 feet tall. I've never seen anything so huge in my life. Their bodies were covered in dark, matted fur, and their faces... God, their faces. They were a bizarre mix of ape and human features, with deep-set eyes that seemed to glow in the reflection of my headlights. I sat there frozen, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. These couldn't be bears. They were standing fully upright on 2 legs, and they were far too large to be any kind of known primate. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds, we just stared at each other. I could see their chests heaving as they breathed, could almost feel the weight of their gaze. Then, as if on some silent signal, they both suddenly turned and sprinted off the road with shocking speed, disappearing into the dense forest. I sat there for several minutes, my heart pounding in my chest. Part of me wanted to get out and investigate, to see if I could find any evidence of what I'd just witnessed. But a primal fear kept me rooted to my seat. Eventually, I managed to put the truck in gear and continue my patrol, though my hands were shaking so badly I could barely steer. The rest of that night is a blur. I finished my shift in a daze, unable to focus on anything but replaying those few surreal moments over and over in my mind. When I got home, I couldn't sleep. I paced around my small cabin, chain-smoking cigarettes and trying to rationalize what I'd seen. The next day, I seriously considered reporting the incident. But who would believe me? I had no proof, no photos, nothing but my word. And as a forest ranger, my credibility was everything. I was afraid of being laughed at, of losing my job, of being labeled as the crazy guy who saw monsters in the woods. So, I kept quiet. For weeks afterward, I was jumpy and on edge during my patrols. Every shadow in the trees, every snapping twig made me flinch. I found myself avoiding that stretch of road near the dam, taking longer routes just to avoid the possibility of another encounter. As time passed, I started to doubt my own memory. Had it really happened? Could I have somehow imagined the whole thing? But deep down, I knew what I saw was real. The sheer size of those creatures, the intelligence in their eyes. It wasn't something my mind could have fabricated. Over the years, I've done a lot of research into Bigfoot sightings and encounters. I've read countless reports from other witnesses, and many of them describe creatures similar to what I saw that night. It's both comforting and unsettling to know I'm not alone in my experience. I've often wondered why they were there on the road that night. Were they crossing to get to the dam? Was it some kind of migration path? And why did they run instead of attacking? So many questions that I'll probably never have answers to. I've gone back to that spot many times over the years, hoping to see some sign of them again. But I've never had another encounter. Sometimes I wonder if maybe they sensed something in me that night, some kind of connection or understanding. Or maybe it was just a random, once-in-a-lifetime crossing of paths between two very different species. The encounter changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. It made me question everything I thought I knew about the natural world and our place in it. How many other undiscovered creatures might be out there, hiding just beyond the edges of our civilization? I'm retired now, living in a small town not far from where it all happened. I still spend a lot of time in the woods, but now it's more out of hope than fear. Hope that maybe, just maybe, I'll get another glimpse of something extraordinary. I know many people won't believe my story, and that's okay. I'm not here to convince anyone or prove anything. I'm just an old man finally unburdening himself of a secret he's carried for far too long. All I can say is this: there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that challenge our understanding of what's possible. I saw two of them that night in 1974, and it forever changed the way I see the world. To this day, I can't drive down a dark, wooded road without scanning the trees, half afraid and half hoping to see those massive figures again. The memory of that night has never faded, and I don't think it ever will. It was the most terrifying and awe-inspiring moment of my life, a brush with something beyond our everyday reality. I often wonder if those creatures are still out there, roaming the vast wilderness of the Bighorn Mountains. Do they remember our encounter as vividly as I do? Do they tell stories of the night they saw a human, just as I'm telling my story now? There are nights when I wake up in a cold sweat, the image of those glowing eyes fresh in my mind. But there are also moments when I feel incredibly lucky to have experienced something so rare and profound. It's a reminder that the world is full of mysteries, and that sometimes, just sometimes, we're granted a glimpse behind the curtain of the unknown. As I sit here writing this, looking out at the forest that borders my property, I can't help but wonder, what other secrets are hiding out there in the wilderness? What other incredible encounters are waiting to happen? I may never know the answers, but I'll always be grateful for that one extraordinary night that opened my eyes to the possibility of the impossible. To anyone reading this who might have had a similar experience, you're not alone, and you're not crazy. There are things in this world that we may never fully understand, but that doesn't make them any less real. And to those who doubt, keep an open mind. You never know when you might find yourself face to face with something that challenges everything you thought you knew about the world around us. Story 17. This particular day in late August, I remember it was unseasonably cool and overcast. We'd been out since dawn, taking measurements and marking waypoints. By mid-afternoon, we were both pretty worn out and decided to call it a day. We packed up our gear and started making our way back to the main road in the truck. We were crawling along this narrow, rutted trail that could barely even be called a road. Thick forest pressed in on both sides, mostly pine and spruce. I was behind the wheel, squinting through the dusty windshield and trying not to bottom out in the deeper ruts. Dave was slumped in the passenger seat, half dozing. Suddenly, movement caught my eye off to the right. At first, I thought it was just shadows from the trees swaying, but then I realized it was something large moving through the underbrush, keeping pace with our slow-moving truck. I slowed down even more, straining to get a better look. "Dave," I hissed, not taking my eyes off the trees. "Wake up and look to your right. Tell me if you see anything." Dave startled awake and peered out the window. "What am I looking for?" he mumbled sleepily. "Just anything moving out there," I said. We both watched intently for a few moments. The forest had gone dead silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the quiet rumble of our idling engine. Then it stepped into view. I slammed on the brakes, and we skidded to a stop in a cloud of dust. About 30 feet away, half hidden behind a massive fallen log, stood the most terrifying creature I've ever laid eyes on. It was huge, at least 7 or 8 feet tall, covered in thick, matted brown fur, massively muscular arms that hung down past its knees, and the face. God, that face. It was disturbingly human-like, with deep-set eyes that gleamed with what I can only describe as intelligence. But the protruding brow, the wide, flat nose, the jutting jaw, there was no mistaking this for a human in a costume. Dave and I sat there frozen, barely breathing. The creature regarded us silently for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. Then it turned its head slightly, as if looking at something behind it. To our shock, 2 smaller creatures emerged from the bushes. They were maybe 3 and 4 feet tall, but with the same general appearance as the larger one. The bigger creature, I assume the adult, put a hand on each of the smaller one's shoulders in an oddly protective gesture. "Holy shit," Dave whispered. "It's a whole family of them." As soon as he spoke, the adult creature's head snapped back toward us. Those piercing eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a chill run down my spine. There was unmistakable intelligence there, and something else. A warning, maybe, or a threat. In one fluid motion, it scooped up the 2 smaller creatures, I guess they were its young, and melted back into the forest. The whole encounter couldn't have lasted more than 30 seconds, but it felt like hours. Dave and I sat there in stunned silence for a long time afterward. Finally, Dave cleared his throat. "Bob," he said shakily, "tell me you saw that too. Tell me I'm not going crazy." "I saw it," I assured him. "Christ almighty, I saw it." We debated what to do. Should we report it? Try to find evidence? In the end, we decided to keep it to ourselves. Who would believe us anyway? We'd be laughed out of town. But I've never forgotten that day. The absolute certainty that we'd seen something that shouldn't exist. Something that turned everything I thought I knew about the natural world on its head. For years afterward, I'd wake up in a cold sweat, those intelligent eyes boring into me from the darkness. I'd find myself scanning the tree line whenever I was in the woods, half expecting to see that massive fur-covered form step out from behind a tree. I've read about other Bigfoot sightings over the years. Some sound pretty far-fetched, but others send that same chill down my spine, because I know the truth. I know they're out there. I'm an old man now. Dave passed away a few years back, taking our secret to his grave. But I can't do that. I need someone else to know what we saw that day, to know that there are things in this world beyond our understanding. so I'm finally sharing this story. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, some days I can barely believe it myself. But I know what I saw, and I'll never forget those eyes, or the way that creature protected its young. It was terrifying, yes, but also almost human. I don't go into the woods much anymore. My surveying days are long behind me. But sometimes on quiet nights, I find myself looking out the window toward the distant tree line, and I wonder, are they still out there? Are there more of them? And what would happen if they decided to make themselves known to the world at large? I don't have answers to those questions. But I know one thing for certain. That day changed me forever. It opened my eyes to possibilities I never would have considered before. And it left me with a mixture of fear and wonder that I've carried with me ever since. So that's my story. Believe it or don't, that's up to you. But I know what I saw, and I'll carry that knowledge with me to my grave. Story 18. It was around 2 a.m. when I was heading home after my shift. The road was pitch black, except for my headlights, winding through thick forest along the Saltu River. I'd driven that route hundreds of times before, but something felt different that night. The air was unusually still and heavy, like the whole forest was holding its breath. As I rounded a bend, my headlights swept across something in the road ahead. At first I thought it was a bear. We got plenty of those in the area, but as I got closer, I realized this was way too big to be a bear, and it was standing upright on 2 legs. My blood turned to ice as I slammed on the brakes. There, illuminated in my high beams, was a massive, hair-covered creature. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, with long arms that hung below its knees. The hair covering its body was a deep reddish-brown color. For a split second, we just stared at each other. Its eyes reflected the light like a deer's would. But there was intelligence there, a spark of awareness that made my skin crawl. This was no animal, at least not any animal I'd ever seen before. Then it moved. Dear God, the way it moved. 1 second, it was standing stock still in the road. The next, it was bounding away on all 4s faster than any human could run. It crossed the road in 2 massive strides and disappeared into the trees. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, heart pounding out of my chest. Part of me wanted to gun the engine and get the hell out of there, but a bigger part needed to know what I'd just seen. Against my better judgment, I slowly got out of the car. The forest was deathly silent. No crickets, no owls, nothing. Just the sound of blood rushing in my ears. I walked to where the creature had been standing and shone my flashlight on the ground. There in the gravel were footprints, if you could call them that. They were huge, easily 15 inches long, with 5 distinct toes. I followed the tracks to the tree line, my hands shaking as I pushed aside some branches. That's when the smell hit me, a powerful, musky odor that made my eyes water, like wet dog mixed with rotting vegetation. Suddenly, a twig snapped in the darkness ahead of me. I swung my flashlight toward the sound and caught a brief glimpse of those glowing eyes again, watching me from the shadows. A low growl rumbled through the trees, so deep I felt it in my chest. I'd like to say I stood my ground, but that would be a lie. I ran back to my car so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet. I peeled out of there, tires squealing on the asphalt. I didn't slow down until I was safely home with the doors locked behind me. I barely slept that night, jumping at every little sound. When morning came, I convinced myself it had all been some kind of hallucination. Maybe I'd dozed off at the wheel for a second. Maybe it was just a bear, and my tired mind played tricks on me. I almost had myself believing it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd seen something that wasn't supposed to exist. It gnawed at me all day. Finally, that evening, I drove back out to that stretch of road. I had to know for sure. The footprints were still there in the gravel, huge and unmistakable, and leading into the forest was a path of broken branches and trampled undergrowth. like something very large had come crashing through. I stood there for a long time, staring into those dark woods. Part of me wanted to follow the trail, to find proof of what I'd seen, but a deeper instinct held me back. Whatever was in there, it didn't want to be found, and maybe it was better that way. I never saw the creature again after that night. But sometimes when I'm driving those back roads late at night, I catch myself scanning the trees, wondering if those eyes are out there, watching from the darkness, wondering if it remembers me the way I remember it. I've never told anyone this story before now. Who would believe me? But I know what I saw that night, and I know that deep in those woods there are things that defy explanation, things that remind us that we don't know nearly as much about this world as we think we do. To this day, I can't explain what I encountered on that lonely road. Was it some undiscovered species? A creature from Native American legend come to life? Or something else entirely? I don't have any answers. All I know is that it shook me to my core and changed the way I see the world. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else has seen it over the years, if there are others out there with stories like mine, too afraid of ridicule to come forward. I've thought about reporting it to authorities or researchers, but what would I say? I have no proof, just the vivid memory seared into my mind. In the years since, I've read about other sightings in the area, glimpses of large, hair-covered creatures in the woods, strange footprints found by hikers. It makes me wonder how many of these encounters go unreported. How many people have brushed up against the unknown and kept it to themselves out of fear or disbelief. I still live in the same town, still drive those roads at night sometimes. But I'm always alert now, always watching the tree line. That brief encounter changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there are things in this world beyond our comprehension. I don't expect anyone to believe my story. Hell, there are days I'm not sure I believe it myself, but I know what I saw that night. And I know that somewhere out there, in the depths of the forest, there are secrets waiting to be discovered. Mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about the natural world. So if you're ever driving down a lonely road late at night, keep your eyes open. You never know what might be lurking just beyond the reach of your headlights. And if you do see something that shouldn't exist, know that you're not alone. There are others out there who have glimpsed the unknown. We may not have answers, but we have our stories. And sometimes that's enough. Story 19. It was late November, and winter had come early that year. A thick blanket of snow covered the ground, muffling all the usual nighttime sounds. I remember thinking how peaceful it was as I stoked the fire in our wood stove before heading to bed. I must have dozed off pretty quickly, but sometime in the dead of night, I was jolted awake by the most horrifying sound I've ever heard in my life. It was like nothing I can really describe, part scream, part roar, but with this eerie, almost human quality to it. It echoed through the valley, seeming to shake the very walls of our farmhouse. My wife clutched my arm, her eyes wide with fear. "Ray, what on earth was that?" she whispered. I tried to play it cool, told her it was probably just a mountain lion or something, but my heart was racing. That sound. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever encountered in these woods. We lay there in the darkness, straining our ears. For a long while, there was nothing but silence. Then we heard it again. That same blood-curdling shriek, but closer this time. It sounded like it was coming from just beyond our property line, maybe 100 yards from the house. I'll admit, I was scared out of my wits, but I knew I had to investigate, to make sure whatever it was wasn't going to be a threat to us or our livestock. I grabbed my rifle and flashlight, pulled on my boots and coat, and headed out into the frigid night. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the swirling snowflakes. Everything was so still and quiet now, it was hard to believe that ungodly noise had shattered the peace just moments before. As I approached the tree line at the edge of our property, my light caught something that made my blood run cold. There, in the fresh snow, was a set of tracks unlike anything I'd ever seen. They were huge, easily 18 inches long, and deeply pressed into the snow. Whatever had made them was heavy, really heavy. I followed the tracks for a bit, my mind racing. Could it be a bear? But bears would be in hibernation this time of year. And those tracks, they looked almost human-like, but impossibly large. That's when I heard a rustling in the trees ahead of me. I swung my light in that direction, and I swear I caught a glimpse of something massive moving through the forest. It was just for a split second, but I saw a flash of dark, shaggy fur disappearing behind a large pine tree. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I stood there, frozen, for what felt like an eternity. Part of me wanted to pursue, to get a better look at whatever this thing was. But a stronger part, the part that wanted to live, told me to turn tail and get the hell out of there. I started backing away slowly, keeping my light trained on the spot where I'd seen the creature. As I did, something caught my eye. There, snagged on the rough bark of the pine tree, were several long, coarse hairs. They were unlike any animal fur I'd ever seen, dark brown, almost black, and incredibly thick. Without really thinking, I reached out and plucked a few of the hairs from the tree. Then I turned and hightailed it back to the house as fast as my legs could carry me. My wife was waiting anxiously by the door. "Ray, what happened? What did you see?" she asked, her voice trembling. I showed her the hairs and told her about the tracks and the glimpse I'd caught of whatever it was. We didn't sleep a wink that night. We sat up by the fire, jumping at every little sound, half expecting to hear that terrifying scream again. But the night passed without further incident. The next morning, I went back out to check the area in the daylight. The tracks were still there, clear as day in the snow. I took some measurements and even some photos with our old Polaroid camera. But the strangest thing was, the tracks just seemed to stop abruptly at the edge of a clearing. It was like whatever made them had simply vanished into thin air. Over the next few days, we asked around to see if any of our neighbors had heard or seen anything unusual. A few mentioned hearing a strange noise that night, but no one had experienced anything quite like what we had. I sent those hairs I'd found to a lab for analysis, hoping to get some answers. But when the results came back, they only deepened the mystery. The lab report said the hairs didn't match any known animal species. They were primate-like, but not human or any known ape. In the weeks and months that followed, we never heard that scream again. We never saw any more giant tracks or caught any more glimpses of a large, furry creature in the woods. Life on the farm went back to normal, but I never quite shook the feeling that we were being watched whenever we ventured near the forest's edge. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night in Drayton Valley. Was it some unknown animal, a creature that science hasn't discovered yet? Or was it something else? Something that shouldn't exist, but somehow does. I've heard stories since then, whispers about something people call Bigfoot or Sasquatch, and I can't help but wonder if that's what we encountered that night. The size of those tracks, the inhuman scream, the strange fur, it all fits with the descriptions I've heard. But whatever it was, that experience changed me. It opened my eyes to the fact that there are things out there we can't explain, things that defy our understanding of the world. And let me tell you, once you've had an encounter like that, you never look at the wilderness the same way again. Sometimes, on quiet winter nights, I find myself straining my ears, half expecting to hear that bone-chilling scream echoing through the valley once more. And every time I venture into the woods, I can't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, hidden in the shadows, something is watching, waiting. And maybe, just maybe, it remembers that night as vividly as I do. Story 20. I still remember that day like it was yesterday, even though it happened over 40 years ago when I was just 14 years old. It was the summer of 1979, and my best friend Jake and I were spending a few weeks at my uncle's cabin near North Buck Lake in northern Michigan. We loved going there every summer to fish, swim, and explore the woods. That particular day started out pretty normal. Jake and I woke up early, grabbed some Pop-Tarts for breakfast, and headed out to do some fishing at the lake. We spent most of the morning out on my uncle's small boat, not catching much, but enjoying being out on the water. By early afternoon, we were getting hungry and bored, so we decided to head back to the cabin for lunch. On the drive back, we were taking the narrow dirt road that winds through the dense forest surrounding the lake. I was behind the wheel of my uncle's old pickup truck. He'd let me drive it on the back roads, even though I didn't have my license yet. Jake was in the passenger seat, fiddling with the radio, trying to find a station that would come in clearly. We came around a bend in the road, and that's when I saw it. About 50 yards ahead of us, there was this thing walking along the side of the road. At first glance, I thought it was a bear standing on its hind legs, but as we got closer, I realized it was way too tall to be a bear, and the way it was walking was all wrong, smooth and upright, almost like a person, but not quite. I instinctively took my foot off the gas, and the truck started to slow. Jake was still messing with the radio and hadn't noticed anything yet. I remember my heart starting to race as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The creature was easily 7 or 8 feet tall, covered in dark brown hair or fur. It had long arms that hung down past its knees and a slightly hunched posture. As we got closer, maybe 30 yards away now, the thing suddenly seemed to notice our truck approaching. It turned its head to look at us, and I caught a glimpse of its face. It was... I don't even know how to describe it. Not quite human, not quite animal. Somewhere in between. Its eyes looked intelligent, alert. I remember they seemed to glow slightly in the shadows. That's when Jake finally looked up and saw it too. He let out this strangled yelp of surprise and fear. The creature's head snapped towards the sound, and for a split second, we made direct eye contact. I'll never forget the look in its eyes, a mix of curiosity and alarm. Then everything happened so fast. The thing suddenly dropped into a crouch, like a football player about to sprint. In one fluid motion, it launched itself off the road and into the thick brush alongside it. The speed and agility were unreal. 1 second it was there, the next it had vanished into the forest. I slammed on the brakes and the truck skidded to a stop, kicking up a cloud of dust. Jake and I just sat there in stunned silence for a few moments, trying to process what we'd just seen. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. What? What the hell was that? Jake finally sputtered out. I don't know, I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. Did you see how fast it moved? Nothing that big should be able to move like that. We sat there for another minute or two, both scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. But the forest was eerily still and silent. No birds chirping, no rustling in the underbrush. It was like everything was holding its breath. Finally, I put the truck back in drive, and we continued on to the cabin. We were both pretty shaken up. When we got back, we told my uncle what we'd seen. He listened patiently, but I could tell he was skeptical. He said it was probably just a bear, and our young imaginations had run wild. But I knew what we saw wasn't any bear. That night, lying in my bunk in the cabin's loft, I kept replaying the encounter in my mind. The way it moved, the intelligence in its eyes, how quickly it vanished into the woods. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen before or since. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every creak of the cabin's old wooden beams made me jump. I kept imagining I could hear heavy footsteps circling outside. At one point, I could have sworn I heard a low, guttural vocalization coming from the woods. But when I woke Jake up to listen, there was only silence. The next morning, Jake and I went back to the spot on the road where we'd seen the creature. We searched the area for any signs, footprints, broken branches, tufts of fur caught on the bushes. But we found nothing. It was like it had never happened. We spent the rest of that summer jumping at shadows, always feeling like we were being watched when we ventured into the woods. We never saw the creature again, but the memory of that encounter stayed with us. Over the years, I've tried to rationalize what we saw that day. Maybe it was just a bear, and our teenage minds exaggerated the details. Maybe it was some kind of hoax or someone in a costume, but deep down, I know those explanations don't fit. What we encountered that summer day in 1979 was something else entirely, something that wasn't supposed to exist. I'm 57 years old now, and I've never told many people about what Jake and I saw. Most would probably think I was crazy or making it up, but I know what I saw. And on quiet nights when I'm lying in bed and the house is still, my mind often drifts back to that moment on that dusty back road. I can still see those intelligent eyes staring back at me, still feel that jolt of primal fear. And I wonder, is it still out there, lurking in the forests of northern Michigan? And how many others have seen it but been too afraid to tell their story? I don't have any answers, but I know that encounter changed me. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk just beyond the edge of our understanding. And sometimes, if we're not careful, we might just catch a glimpse of them. Story 21. As the sun started to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the field, I remember thinking we should probably wrap up the game soon, but we were all having too much fun to stop just yet. My youngest brother Tommy had just hit a long fly ball into the outfield when we heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold and the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It started as a low wail, almost like a siren in the distance, but there was something off about it. It didn't sound mechanical or man-made. It had an organic, animalistic quality that sent chills down my spine. The pitch rose higher and higher until it was an ear-piercing shriek that seemed to cut right through me. We all froze, eyes wide, searching the dim field and the woods beyond for the source of that horrifying sound. Tommy dropped the bat with a clatter that made us all jump. For a moment there was silence, broken only by our ragged breathing. Then it came again, that awful wailing cry, closer this time. It sounded like it was coming from just beyond the tree line at the edge of the field. As it reached its crescendo, the cry changed, morphing into a deep, guttural growl that resonated in my chest. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, not quite human, not quite animal. Panic gripped me as I looked at my brother's terrified faces. Without a word, we all turned and ran for home as fast as our legs could carry us. I could hear Tommy crying as he sprinted alongside me. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves made me flinch, imagining some nightmarish creature bursting from the woods in pursuit. We burst through the back door, slamming it behind us and locking it with trembling hands. Our parents rushed in from the living room, alarmed by our panicked entrance. Between gasping breaths, we tried to explain what we'd heard out in the field. Dad grabbed a flashlight and his shotgun, heading outside to investigate while Mom tried to calm us down. I begged him not to go, terrified that whatever had made those sounds would get him. He assured us it was probably just some kind of animal, maybe a mountain lion that had wandered down from the hills. We huddled together in the living room, jumping at every little noise outside. After what felt like hours, Dad finally came back inside. He hadn't found anything unusual, no tracks or signs of any large animals. But the look on his face told me he was unsettled too, even if he was trying to hide it for our sake. None of us slept well that night. I kept replaying that awful sound in my head, imagining shadowy figures lurking just outside my window. In the days that followed, we scoured the local papers and asked around town, but no one else seemed to have heard anything strange that night. We never did figure out what made those terrifying sounds. Sometimes I tried to convince myself it was just some animal, or maybe even our imaginations running wild in the dark. But deep down, I know what I heard was real, and I know it wasn't anything natural or normal. For weeks afterwards, I had nightmares about being chased through dark woods by some nameless, howling thing. Even now, decades later, I still get a chill down my spine when I think about that night. My brothers and I don't talk about it much, but I know it haunts them too. That summer night changed something in me. I've always been a rational, level-headed person, but after what I experienced, I can't help but wonder what other unexplained things might be out there, just beyond the edge of the woods or lurking in the shadows. I still live in Morley, not far from that old baseball field. Sometimes on quiet summer nights, I find myself straining to listen, half expecting to hear that blood-curdling wail again. Part of me hopes I never will. But another part wonders if maybe, just maybe, I'll finally get some answers about what really happened that night back in '85. The incident has stuck with me all these years, coloring how I see the world. I've become fascinated with stories of strange creatures and unexplained phenomena. I've read countless books and articles, scoured websites and forums looking for similar encounters. Sometimes I've found stories that send a shiver of recognition through me, tales of eerie, impossible sounds in the night that defy explanation. I've gone back to that field many times over the years, both alone and with my brothers. We've never experienced anything like that night again. But standing there, looking out at those woods, I can't shake the feeling that something is watching, waiting. I've tried to rationalize it, to explain it away. Maybe it was some kind of bizarre atmospheric phenomenon or a combination of animal sounds distorted by the wind. But none of the explanations quite fit. None of them capture the raw, primal fear I felt when I heard that sound. My youngest brother Tommy was hit hardest by the experience. He had nightmares for months afterwards and refused to go anywhere near the woods. Even now, as a grown man, he gets visibly uncomfortable when the topic comes up. I feel guilty sometimes, wondering if I should have done more to protect him that night. The incident changed our family dynamics in subtle ways. We became more protective of each other, more aware of the potential dangers lurking in the world. Family camping trips were quietly phased out. Our parents installed better locks on the doors and windows. I've often wondered what would have happened if we'd stayed out in that field just a little longer. Would we have seen something? Would it have come for us? Sometimes I'm grateful we ran when we did. Other times, I wish we'd had the courage to investigate, to finally know the truth. Over the years, I've occasionally met other locals who hint at strange experiences in the woods around Morley. Most are reluctant to go into detail, but there's a look in their eyes I recognize, a mix of fear and wonder, and the weight of carrying around an experience they can't fully explain. I've thought about reaching out to paranormal investigators or cryptozoologists, but something always holds me back. Part of me is afraid they'll dismiss the whole thing, tell me it was just an overactive imagination or a misheard animal call, and part of me is afraid they'll believe me, that they'll find evidence of something that maybe we're not meant to understand. So I carry this experience with me, turning it over in my mind like a puzzle I can't quite solve. It's shaped who I am in ways both big and small. I'm more open-minded now, more willing to consider possibilities beyond our current understanding of the world. But I'm also more cautious, more aware of the potential dangers hiding in the shadows. I make sure my own kids are always inside before dark. I keep a wary eye on the woods when I'm out for a walk. And on quiet nights, when the wind is still and the crickets are chirping, I find myself listening. Always listening. I don't know if I'll ever get answers about what really happened that night in 1985. Maybe it's better that way. But I know what I heard, what my brothers and I experienced. And I know that somewhere out there, in the dark spaces between what we know and what we fear, something waits. Something that can make a sound so terrifying, so alien, that it shakes you to your very core. So if you're ever in Morley on a warm summer night, and you hear something strange carried on the breeze, something that makes your heart race and your skin prickle with fear, don't dismiss it. Don't try to explain it away. Because maybe, just maybe, you're hearing an echo of what we encountered all those years ago. And if you are, my advice is simple. Run. Run as fast as you can, and don't look back, because some mysteries are better left unsolved. Story 22. I still can't believe what happened that summer at Hague Lake. Even now, over 30 years later, I get chills thinking about it. It was 1988, and I was 12 years old. My family had rented a small cabin by the lake for a week-long vacation. We had been there a few days already, swimming and fishing and enjoying the peaceful wilderness. That morning started out normal enough. My parents were sitting on the porch drinking coffee while my little brother and I ate breakfast inside. I remember complaining about the soggy cereal and begging to go down to the lake. It was a beautiful sunny day, and I was eager to get outside. Finally, around 10 a.m., we all headed down to the water. My dad carried the cooler, while my mum lugged the beach bag full of towels and sunscreen. My brother ran ahead, kicking up dirt on the path through the woods. I trailed behind, swatting at mosquitoes and picking up interesting rocks. We got to our usual spot on the small beach and set up our chairs and umbrella. The lake was calm and mirror-like, reflecting the trees and blue sky. A few ducks paddled by, leaving V-shaped ripples in their wake. It was idyllic and peaceful. I never could have imagined the terror that was about to unfold. I had just waded into the cool water up to my knees when I heard my mother gasp sharply. I turned to look at her and saw her face had gone pale. She was staring wide-eyed at something on the opposite shore, her hand covering her mouth. My dad stood up quickly, shielding his eyes from the sun to peer across the lake. "What is that?" he muttered. "Is that a person?" I squinted in the direction they were looking. At first I didn't see anything unusual, just the trees and underbrush along the shoreline. But then I saw movement. Something large and dark was moving through the trees, partially obscured by the foliage. As I watched, the figure emerged onto a small clearing by the water's edge. My blood ran cold. It was definitely not a person. The creature was massive, at least 7 feet tall, and covered in shaggy grey and black fur. It walked on 2 legs but had an odd loping gait. The arms were unnaturally long, hanging down past its knees. I couldn't make out the face clearly at that distance, but I could see that the head was large and somewhat cone-shaped. It moved with surprising speed and agility for its size, striding purposefully along the shore. "Oh my God," my mother whispered. "What is that thing?" My little brother started crying, clinging to my mom's leg. I was rooted to the spot, unable to move or look away from the monster across the lake. Part of my brain was trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was just a bear standing on its hind legs. But I knew that wasn't right. This was something else entirely. The creature paused by the water and seemed to look in our direction. A chill ran down my spine. Even from this distance, I had the distinct feeling it was staring right at us. My dad snapped out of his shocked daze and started gathering our things. "We need to go. Now." His voice was tense and clipped. Mom scooped up my crying brother, and we all hurried back up the path to the cabin. I kept looking over my shoulder, terrified the beast would come charging across the lake after us. But when I glanced back, it was gone, vanished back into the woods as suddenly as it had appeared. We spent the rest of the day huddled in the cabin, all plans of swimming and hiking forgotten. My parents spoke in hushed tones, debating whether to cut the vacation short and leave. They tried to convince themselves it must have just been a bear, but I could tell they didn't really believe that. As night fell, an eerie quiet settled over the woods. No chirping crickets or hooting owls, just dead silence. We ate dinner in tense silence, jumping at every little creak or rustle outside. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Around 9 p.m. we heard a series of loud whooping calls echoing across the lake. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard before, somewhere between a howl and a scream. My brother started sobbing again, and even my stoic father looked shaken. "That's it. We're leaving first thing in the morning," he announced. No one argued. I barely slept that night, lying awake and straining to hear any sounds of the creature lurking outside. Every shadow seemed menacing. Every gust of wind sounded like heavy footsteps. I kept replaying the sight of that hulking, furry form in my mind. When the sun finally rose, we threw our luggage in the car in record time. As we were doing one final sweep of the cabin, my dad suddenly called out from the yard, "Hey, come look at this!" We hurried outside. He was crouched near the tree line, examining something on the ground. As I got closer, I saw what had caught his attention, a series of huge, deeply pressed footprints in the soft dirt. They were over 15 inches long and clearly not human. Whatever had made them had been mere yards from our cabin in the night. Mom let out a strangled sob and ushered us to the car. Dad snapped a few photos of the prints with his camera before joining us. The drive home was subdued and tense. We were all processing what we had seen and trying to make sense of it. In the following weeks, my parents reported the sighting to the local rangers and showed them the photos of the footprints. They seemed skeptical, but said they would look into it. We never heard anything more about it officially. I've spent years researching and trying to find an explanation for what we encountered that day. I've read about Bigfoot and other cryptid sightings. I've joined online forums to connect with others who've had similar experiences, but I've never found a fully satisfying answer. All I know is that something terrifying and inexplicable lives in those woods by Hague Lake. The memory of that massive, fur-covered shape moving with unnatural speed and grace still haunts my dreams. I've never been camping since then. The wilderness holds too many dark secrets, too many things that defy explanation. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, lurking in the shadows and watching unsuspecting families enjoy the lake. Part of me hopes I imagined it all, but deep down I know what I saw was real. And that's what scares me most of all. Story 23. I still remember that day like it was yesterday, even though it's been over 30 years now. It was the summer of 1991, and a group of us college buddies had decided to take a hiking trip in Glacier National Park. We were all pumped for some adventure in the great outdoors, completely oblivious to the bizarre encounter that awaited us on the trail. There were 5 of us, me, Tom, Mike, Dave, and Chris. We'd been planning this trip for months, eager to explore the rugged wilderness and stunning vistas of Glacier. The Stanley Glacier Trail was our chosen route for the day. We'd heard it offered some spectacular views and wasn't too strenuous, perfect for a bunch of out-of-shape city boys like us. We set out early that morning, the air crisp and invigorating. The trail started off easy enough, winding through dense forest. We were in high spirits, cracking jokes and taking in the scenery. I remember feeling so alive, surrounded by towering pines and the sound of a nearby stream. About an hour into the hike, we emerged from the tree line into a more open area. The landscape changed dramatically. We were now surrounded by rocky slopes and patches of snow. The The glacier loomed in the distance, a massive sheet of ice that seemed to touch the sky. It was breathtaking. We stopped for a quick water break, and that's when things started to get weird. I noticed Mike staring intently at something in the distance. "Guys," he said, his voice low and tense, "what the hell is that?" We all turned to look. At first, I didn't see anything out of the ordinary, just rocks and scrubby vegetation. But then I saw it. Moving across a rocky slope about 100 yards away was something. It was big, that's for sure, and it was covered in hair. My first thought was that it must be a bear, but as I watched it move, I realized this was no bear. It was walking upright on 2 legs, and it was fast, incredibly fast. It bounded across the uneven terrain with an ease that seemed impossible for its size. "Holy shit," Tom whispered beside me. Is that what I think it is?" None of us wanted to say it out loud. It seemed too crazy, too impossible. But we were all thinking the same thing. Bigfoot. The creature was massive, easily over 6 feet tall. Its body was covered in long, shaggy hair that looked almost blonde in the sunlight. It moved with a fluid grace that was both beautiful and terrifying. We watched in stunned silence as it made its way across the slope. Suddenly, it came to a fallen tree blocking its path. Without breaking stride, the creature literally leaped over the massive trunk. It must have cleared at least 15 feet in a single bound. My jaw dropped. No human could jump like that, and I'd never seen any animal move that way either. But the real kicker came next. The creature approached another fallen tree, this one even larger than the last. Instead of jumping, it stopped. And then, to our utter disbelief, it reached out with 2 massive hands and pushed. The entire tree, which must have weighed several tons, moved. It didn't just budge a little, it slid several feet, as if it weighed nothing at all. I felt a chill run down my spine. The strength required to do something like that was beyond comprehension. We were witnessing something that defied everything we thought we knew about the natural world. The creature continued on its way, disappearing behind a rocky outcropping. We all stood there, frozen, trying to process what we'd just seen. It was Chris who finally broke the silence. Did that really just happen?" he asked, his voice shaky. We all nodded slowly, still too shocked to speak. Part of me wanted to convince myself it was just a bear, or maybe some elaborate hoax. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen. We all did. "Should we try to follow it?" Dave suggested hesitantly. The idea sent a jolt of fear through me. "Are you crazy?" I blurted out. "Did you see how fast that thing moved, how strong it was? We wouldn't stand a chance if it decided to attack." The others murmured in agreement. We were all adventurous guys, but this was way out of our league. Whatever that creature was, it clearly didn't want to be found. And honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted to find it either. We debated what to do next. Part of me wanted to turn back, to get as far away from this place as possible. But another part was curious. Would we see it again? Could we get proof of what we'd witnessed? In the end, curiosity won out. We decided to continue our hike, but with a new sense of caution. Every rustle in the bushes, every snapping twig made us jump. I kept expecting to see that massive hair-covered figure emerge from behind a rock or tree. As we hiked, we tried to rationalize what we'd seen. Maybe it was some kind of escaped circus animal, or a person in a really convincing costume. But deep down, we all knew those explanations didn't add up. What we'd seen was something else entirely. We reached Stanley Glacier a few hours later, but the breathtaking views couldn't distract us from what had happened. We kept scanning the surrounding slopes, half expecting and half dreading to see the creature again. On the hike back, we stuck close together, constantly looking over our shoulders. Every shadow seemed to move, every distant sound could have been heavy footsteps. The beautiful wilderness that had so excited us that morning now felt ominous and alien. We made it back to our campsite just as the sun was setting. Huddled around the campfire that night, we talked about what we'd seen. Should we report it to the park rangers? Would anyone even believe us? In the end, we decided to keep it to ourselves. Who would take 5 college guys seriously if we started talking about Bigfoot? That night, as I lay in my tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every sound outside made me tense up. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind. The fluid movement, the impossible strength, those long blonde hairs catching the sunlight. It was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. We cut our trip short the next day, all of us too on edge to enjoy the rest of our planned hikes. As we drove home, we made a pact not to talk about what we'd seen. Who would believe us anyway? But I've never forgotten that day. It changed something in me, shook my understanding of the world. There are things out there we can't explain, creatures that defy our understanding of what's possible. I've never gone back to that trail, and I've never seen anything like that creature again. But I know what I saw. And sometimes on quiet nights I find myself wondering, is it still out there, moving silently through the wilderness, just beyond the edge of what we know? Story 24. It was July 1993, and I was 16 years old. My parents had signed me up for a 2-week wilderness camp in the mountains of Northern California. I wasn't thrilled about it at first. I would have rather spent my summer hanging out with friends back home. But as an only child, my parents were always pushing me to be more outdoorsy and social. The first week at camp was pretty standard: hiking, canoeing, campfire sing-alongs, that kind of thing. I made a few friends, including my bunkmate Jake and a girl named Melissa, who I had a bit of a crush on. By the second week, we had all gotten comfortable with the routines and rhythms of camp life. On the night it happened, we were doing an overnight camping trip a few miles from the main camp. There were about 15 of us campers, along with 2 counselors. We had spent the day hiking and setting up our tents in a small clearing surrounded by towering redwoods. As night fell, we gathered around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling ghost stories. I remember it was a clear night, with a bright full moon hanging overhead. Around 11 p.m. the counselors told us it was time to turn in. Jake, Melissa and I were still wide awake, though. We decided to sneak out of our tents once everyone was asleep and go exploring. It must have been close to midnight when we quietly unzipped our tents and crept out into the moonlit forest. We had flashlights, but tried not to use them much so we wouldn't wake anyone up. The 3 of us hiked about half a mile from our campsite, following a narrow trail through the woods. That's when we came upon the old fire lookout tower. It was this rickety wooden structure, probably 40 or 50 feet tall, rising above the treetops. In the silvery moonlight, it looked both eerie and enticing. Of course, we decided we had to climb it. The wooden steps creaked under our feet as we made our way up. My heart was pounding, both from the climb and the thrill of our little adventure. When we reached the top, the view was incredible. We could see for miles in every direction, nothing but a vast sea of treetops under the starry sky. We hung out up there for maybe 15 minutes, talking in hushed voices and taking in the view. That's when Jake suddenly went quiet mid-sentence. I turned to look at him and saw his eyes were wide with fear, fixed on something behind me. I spun around, and that's when I saw it. There was something crouched on the railing on the far side of the platform. In the moonlight, I could make out a massive hair-covered form. It was easily 7 or 8 feet tall, even in its hunched position. For a moment, we all just froze. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. Was it a bear? No, the proportions were all wrong. This thing was huge, but distinctly humanoid in shape. Suddenly, its head snapped towards us. I'll never forget those eyes. They seemed to glow with an unnatural yellowish light. In that moment, I knew we were looking at something that shouldn't exist. Before any of us could react, the creature let out a blood-curdling shriek. It was unlike anything I've ever heard. This high-pitched, almost electronic-sounding wail that seemed to vibrate through my whole body. I involuntarily clamped my hands over my ears. Then, in one fluid motion, it leapt from the tower. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. This massive creature had just jumped from a 50-foot tower like it was nothing. We rushed to the railing, expecting to see it splattered on the ground below. Instead, we saw it racing away through the forest at impossible speed. As it ran, trees were snapping and crashing down in its wake. The sound of splintering wood and that awful shriek echoed through the night. We stood there in stunned silence for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Melissa broke the spell by bursting into tears. That snapped Jake and me back to reality. We practically flew down those tower steps, stumbling and tripping in our haste to get back to the relative safety of our campsite. We burst into the clearing, yelling and waking everyone up. The counselors were furious at first, thinking we were playing some kind of prank. But they must have seen the genuine terror on our faces, because their anger quickly turned to concern. We tried to explain what we had seen, but it all came out as a jumbled mess. A giant creature, yellow eyes, inhuman shrieks, impossible leaps. The counselors clearly didn't believe us, but they could see we were genuinely shaken. They decided to pack up camp immediately and hike back to the main campgrounds. I think they assumed we had seen a bear and panicked, even though we insisted it was something much stranger. The hike back was tense and terrifying. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves had us jumping out of our skin. When we got back to the main camp, the head counselor called our parents to come pick us up early. They told them there had been some kind of incident that had upset us, but didn't go into details. I think they were worried about getting in trouble for letting us wander off alone at night. My parents were pretty upset when they arrived the next day. I tried to tell them what had happened, but they assumed I was either making it up or had some kind of stress-induced hallucination. They ended up sending me to a therapist for a few sessions, but I eventually just stopped talking about it. Over the years, I've done a lot of research trying to make sense of what we saw that night. I've read about Bigfoot sightings and other strange cryptid encounters. Some details seem to line up, but nothing quite matches the otherworldly creature we encountered. I've stayed in touch with Jake and Melissa over the years. We don't talk about that night much, but I know it affected them as deeply as it did me. Sometimes I wonder if we really saw what I think we saw. But then I remember those glowing eyes, that horrifying shriek, and the impossible agility of that massive creature. And I know that whatever it was real. I still love the outdoors and go camping fairly often, but I've never been able to shake the feeling that there's something out there in the wilderness, something that defies explanation. Every time I'm in the woods at night and hear an unexplained sound, my mind races back to that fire tower and the terrifying encounter that changed my life forever. Story 25. The Silver Ridge Trail was supposed to be a moderate 12-mile loop through some beautiful forest and mountain terrain. We'd done plenty of day hikes before, but this was our first time camping overnight on the trail. Looking back, maybe we should have picked an easier route for our first overnighter, but we were young and cocky and thought we could handle anything. We got to the trailhead around 10 a.m. on a Saturday morning in early June. The weather was perfect, sunny and warm, but not too hot. As we shouldered our packs and headed out, I remember feeling so alive and excited for the adventure ahead. If only I'd known what was waiting for us up on that mountain. The first few hours of the hike were great. The trail wound through dense pine forest, occasionally opening up to reveal stunning vistas of the surrounding peaks. We took our time, stopping often to drink water and snack on trail mix. Around 2 p.m. we reached a scenic overlook that seemed like the perfect spot for lunch. We dropped our packs and sat on some rocks, munching sandwiches and taking in the breathtaking view of the valley below. After lunch we continued on, the trail getting steeper and more challenging as we gained elevation. By late afternoon, my legs were starting to feel the burn, but I was still in good spirits. We figured we had another couple hours of hiking before we'd reach the backcountry campsite, where we planned to spend the night. It was around 5:30 p.m. when everything changed. We had just rounded a bend in the trail when Jake suddenly froze, grabbing my arm. "Dude, what the hell is that?" he whispered, pointing up the slope to our left. I followed his gaze and felt my blood run cold. About 100 yards away, moving down the steep face of the mountain, was something. At first glance it looked like a bear, but it was all wrong. It was massive, way bigger than any bear I'd ever seen, and the way it was moving was just unnatural. It was coming down the near vertical slope at an incredible speed, using its arms to propel itself in giant bounding leaps. As it got closer, I could make out more details, and my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. It wasn't a bear. The proportions were all wrong. It was clearly bipedal, with long arms that nearly reached the ground. The entire body was covered in dark brown, matted fur, and it was huge, at least 8 feet tall, probably more. For a few seconds, Jake and I just stood there, frozen in shock and disbelief. Then the thing turned its head and looked directly at us. I'll never forget those eyes. They were unmistakably intelligent, and filled with what looked like surprise and anger at being spotted. That's when the paralysis broke and panic set in. Without a word, Jake and I turned and started sprinting back down the trail. I've never run so fast in my life. My heart was pounding and I could barely breathe, but raw adrenaline and terror kept me going. After a minute or two, I chanced a glance over my shoulder. The creature was following us, moving incredibly fast, despite the rough terrain. It was using its long arms almost like crutches, swinging them forward to propel itself in huge, bounding strides. It was gaining on us rapidly. "It's coming!" I managed to gasp out to Jake. He responded by veering off the trail into the thick underbrush. I followed without hesitation. We crashed through the forest, heedless of the branches whipping our faces and arms. All that mattered was putting distance between us and that thing. I have no idea how long we ran for. It felt like hours, but was probably only 15-20 minutes. Eventually, we burst out of the woods onto a small cliff overlooking a river about 30 feet below. We skidded to a stop at the edge, chests heaving as we tried to catch our breath. "Do you see it?" Jake panted, scanning the tree line behind us. I shook my head, still too winded to speak. We stood there for several long minutes, straining our ears for any sound of pursuit, but heard only birds and the rush of the river below. Finally, Jake turned to me with wild eyes. "What the fuck was that thing, man?" I shook my head again. I don't know. It looked like, but it couldn't be." "Bigfoot," Jake said flatly. "We just saw fucking Bigfoot." I wanted to argue, to say that was impossible, but I couldn't deny what my own eyes had seen. That thing, whatever it was no normal animal. The intelligence in its eyes, the way it moved, it was something else entirely. We debated what to do next. Part of me wanted to just keep running until we got back to the car. But we had left our packs back on the trail when we first started running. All our food, water, and camping gear was in those packs, and it would be getting dark soon. In the end, we decided to follow the river back towards the trailhead. It would take longer than going back the way we came, but there was no way in hell I was going back into those woods with that thing out there. We had to do some rock scrambling to get down to the riverbank, but once there, we made decent progress following the water downstream. As the adrenaline wore off, exhaustion started to set in. My whole body ached from our frantic run through the forest, but fear kept us moving forward. The sun was setting by the time we finally stumbled out of the woods near the parking area. I've never been so relieved to see my beat-up old Jeep. We practically dove inside, locking the doors behind us. It wasn't until we were speeding down the mountain road that the full weight of what had happened really hit me. We had seen something that shouldn't exist, something that defied explanation. The terror of those moments on the trail came rushing back, and I started shaking uncontrollably. Jake and I didn't talk much on the drive home. What was there to say? We had both seen it, but it still felt unreal, like a shared hallucination or something. When we got back to campus, we debated whether to report what we'd seen to the authorities. But we knew how crazy it would sound. 2 college kids claiming they saw Bigfoot while out hiking. We'd be laughed out of the police station, so we kept it to ourselves. In the days and weeks that followed, I obsessively researched Bigfoot sightings and theories. I found that there had been other reports of similar creatures in that general area over the years, but nothing quite like what Jake and I encountered. It's been over 25 years now, and I still think about that day all the time. Jake and I don't talk much anymore. I think we both prefer to try and forget it ever happened. But I know I never will. The memory of those intelligent, angry eyes staring right at me is seared into my brain forever. I've never gone back to Silver Ridge. Hell, I barely go hiking at all these days, but sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I swear I can hear the sound of heavy footsteps and branches snapping outside my window. And I wonder if that thing is still out there in those mountains, waiting for its next encounter with the human world.